Hello, we are here, and this is Chinese Marxism number 16. So today we're going to be talking a little bit more about Xi Jinping. I never know how to pronounce it. I think Ludovica corrected me. She said C. It's C because I was saying G because it's like I think it's X. And I'm the worst with pronunciation. Someone said I did a video on Italian, I can speak a few words of Italian, but I did a video on Italian Marxism, on which is what Machiavelli and the Italian radical tradition can teach us about the left, which is up with zero. We're not officially affiliated with zero.
But that one is at the Zero Books channel.
That one is officially affiliated, but we're not officially affiliated. Workers, you have nothing to lose but your lanes. But in that video, I apparently mispronounced what was it? What fucking word was it? It was Gramsci. I think I pronounced it 3 different ways in the course of the video, and people were like, "Can you just pick one and stick to it?" Oh, and I think it was Caesar Borgia. I said Caesar Borgia, but then I said it, I used a couple different pronunciations, and people were like Cheshire. It was but it's hard because it's when these things go into different languages, they get modified. For instance, I could say Sartre, or I could say Sartre.
Yeah,
and I don't think it's wrong to say Sartre. It's just because it's an accepted Anglophonization of the name, and so many words are like that because people can't pronounce things. Right?
Yes.
Do you think they say New York the same way in China as they say it in USA? Probably not, right?
No, and the same thing happens in Mexico. I say it's Sartre, right? Because that's how you pronounce it in Spanish, or Hegel, right? And she is just Chi because I don't know.
Chi.
That's how we say it in Spanish.
Che Guevara.
Almost. Maybe there's an analog there.
Actually, I did think it was funny that I don't know if you've seen it. So Fidel Castro. We should share this because there's not too many people right now. Let's just get to the sharing because we got to do that. So guys, give us 1 minute. I just wanted to say hi to everyone, but we have to share this page, so that'll take us a minute. So just give us a second. Be back in 60 seconds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can just chill.
I've been playing the Goldeneye remake.
Oh yeah.
Did you hear about that? Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's quite good.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Wait, where are events? I have to do it on the page. Okay.
Yeah.
It's very faithful to the original. The only differences are it has dual stick, just better textures and stuff, but obviously based on the same code.
Mm-hmm.
And much better frame rate, but it also has local multiplayer and split screen, which is very cool.
So are you playing it on PC?
Yeah, just on PC. I just grabbed a 360 emulator actually. Yeah, it was very easy to do. The only
high-ender.
The only actual change with Goldeneye is they added 3 more single player maps. For multiplayer, which is cool, but there's not many changes. Did you ever play that?
The maps?
Well, I know them. I think it's Frigate, Dam, and Depot, so they're familiar.
Okay, so
they're good. Yeah, I mean anything like that. I played that game so much that it's just any minor change is just so palpable to me.
Yeah.
I'm they add a tuna maps to multiplayer that were already in single player. I'm like, oh my god! I wish maybe they'd fleshed out ideas that weren't finished maybe in the first game a bit more. There's an island in the first level you're supposed to be able to visit that they never got around to programming, and that's the kind of thing that might be cool to kind of add for the new one. But it's so faithful they don't really add anything, which it's well done, but it's just it might have been cool to see a couple Easter eggs,
Yeah.
Just a couple new levels, stuff like that, based on concepts that were never realized. Okay, I've shared. Oh wait, no, I'm almost done. I got to share it to the C group. Okay, here we go. Yeah, they love us over at the Xi Jinping.
Yeah,
China's
a lot of positive feedback.
The only place. I love you know, and I love. Did you see that? Did you see the? I got rid of the guy's name, but did you see? I put the post, like I posted Chinese Marxism, this group, and I think you know it's a little bit tricky because like I don't know exactly what you call it. Like, for instance, I could call it socialism with Chinese characteristics, right? Like I noticed in one of these essays that Xi said like, well, for 60 years we've been doing socialism with Chinese characteristics, but it's like that term actually didn't become popular until like the 80s. So I feel like the risk when you say, obviously, like, you know, there are Chinese Marxist cultures which are outside, you know, the orthodox lineage of the Chinese Communist Party, right? But the thing is, like, when you say Chinese, like it's kind of a hard thing. If you say Chinese Marxism, it potentially means more than just the paramount leaders, you know. But if you say socialism with Chinese characteristics, potentially it overprivileges like kind of post Deng thought. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah.
Rest in peace, Jimmy.
Jimmy
Sullivan. Who's Jimmy Sullivan, and who is this person? Why do we always get such random people on Twitch?
Welcome, Alfred. 70 XXX forever.
So this is our first. Actually, this is an exciting event because I think is this our first official cast just as Capital Comrades?
I think so. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's good. It was like I said. It's like the when P Diddy changed his name to Diddy. You know, it's just like the zero books part was getting us down a bit. We had to just go for the simpler, you know, Capital Comrades. No comment on that. No comment on that extremely stressful evening. For me, though I will simply say that I spent much of the next week reinstating people who were banned spontaneously in that period. So
that's generous.
Without providing too much in the details. Yeah, I'm like I'm Dang over here, right? I'm having to rehabilitate. Yeah, you know, all the members of our group. So today we're going to be doing two. So today we're continuing with the Governance of China, Volume 1. Today we'll be doing 2 essays. And those essays are handle cross-states relations in the overall interest of the Chinese nation and accelerate the development of housing, security, and supply. Before we maybe get to that, I did want to maybe touch on just a few small issues, just things I've been digging into.
Yeah.
I don't know if you had anything you want to put out there before we start.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So the first was I was looking up some of the details because I said that there was some fighting in Xi's government. I think, you know, certainly his power is relatively assured, but there are some issues. So currently, my understanding is there is conflicts with Li Keqiang, who is the premier, right? Yeah. And actually, officially speaking, and let me pull this up. And I've been digging through these details because the Chinese governance structure is quite hard to understand. But Li Keqiang is officially the premier of the State Council, right? So the State Council is sort of like my understanding is it's kind of like a ministerial setup with people who are delegated to deal with different issues. So to try to shed a bit of light on the Chinese governance structure, I maybe there's someone Chinese here and I'm going to bastardize this horribly. Certainly, you know, as a Canadian, I've been so inundated with information about Canada my whole life. I feel like I know it better than anyone like from another country could walk in and like, then they could know it and just like looking through some internet pages or whatever. But, you know, because there's a lot of nuances in how it functions, right? Fortunately, in some ways, I mean, like the thing is, like, China should be easy to understand because it's a unicameral legislature. But the problem is, you have all these other layers that really do things, right? Which are not legislatures at all, right? So it's actually quite complicated. So China has a national legislature that was founded in 1954, and that is called the National People's Congress, right? In addition to that, they have a central committee, which includes about 205 members, and that's comprised of the most powerful people in the country, right? Now, officially, the National People's Congress, they select the members of the central committee. The only problem is that they have to confirm them, but they have to pick a certain number, and they're given a list that usually only has like a few more members than they have to confirm. So all they do in practice is they just pick a few people to exclude from, like, we're like the most hated to like exclude from the list, so that they don't really like confirm it. So that's how that works. And the Central Committee, I think really holds far more power than the National People's Congress. In addition to that, if we get even higher up, we have the Politburo, right? Which has how many members are on the Politburo right now? And the Politburo, by the way, I believe it's selected by the Central Committee. So let me just look at how many members are on the Politburo right now.
It has 7 currently.
You looking at the Standing Committee of the Politburo?
Standing Committee of the Central Political Bureau of the Communist Party of China.
Yeah, that's the Standing Committee. See, that's the core of the Politburo. You have to look at the whole Politburo, because I was going to get to that. There's layers, right?
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, so the Politburo at this moment has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 25 members, right? And then, so again, officially those are selected by the Central Committee, but I think the higher level leadership often is sort of like putting names forth for ratification when it comes to these things. And that's where it gets complicated, because it's not so official. So you really have to know how these things work. You can't read it abstractly. But yeah, you have 25 members of the Politburo, 7 members of the Standing Committee. And then you have the, of course, there's since 1993. What is the title? The exact title is, one second, let me pull this up. The technical title for the highest title is General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. That's the title. And I think like that, I don't know if that flows out of the Standing Committee of the Politburo. One second, let me take a look at that. General Secretary, the head of the Communist Party of China, yeah, is a standing member of the Politburo and head of the Secretariat. So once you go through the different layers, right? You have the National People's Congress, you have the Central Committee, you have the Politburo, you have the Standing Committee of the Politburo, then you have the General Secretary, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So Xi has been and since 1993, while I think traditionally the president was sort of like a ceremonial title. Since 1993 by convention, and this is also what makes Chinese politics complicated, because the meaning, like the semiotic meaning of these terms changes. The power of the person who's been the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party has been also the president by precedent starting in 1993. So Xi Jinping, for example, he is the general secretary, and he's also the president and the chairman of the Central Military Commission, right? So is that kind of clear as regards that? Because I just want to get that all, like, I think it helps us to kind of, so in terms of Li Keqiang, one second.
Yeah.
He is the premier of the State Council. Yeah, synonymous with the Central People's Government, Chief Administrative Authority, and it controls cabinet level executive. It has 35 members who control cabinet level executive departments. And I was just trying to figure out exactly how that was. Yeah, the State Council meets every 6 months. Between meetings, it is guided by the Standing Committee. Yeah, the Vice Premier and State Councilors are nominated by the Premier and appointed by the President with the National Congress, People's Congress approval. Yeah, so in theory, like the Premier, I think, again, what you have here is when you're the Premier, so when you're the leader of the cabinet level, you can pick the actual ministers officially, and then they're confirmed by the National People's Congress. But I think also in reality, like the president can say, like, put that person on, right? Or the general secretary can say, put that person on, and you have to do it, right? So that, probably, yeah. And then of course, I also don't think the National People's Congress has as much authority. Like in the past few years, what's happened is that traditionally the National People's Congress was just a rubber stamping body. But what's happened in the past few years is that they've become more assertive about actually challenging the rules of the government. So there you go. But about this, so Xi is apparently fighting with his own. I went through all this, and I know it's boring, right? I know it's boring, but it's important. Xi is apparently fighting with his own premier, who's Li Keqiang, officially the second most powerful person in China. Now, the thing is, in terms of Xi's power, if you get like on his bad side, you can't really do anything, right? There's not much room to maneuver around. But this is significant because, so there's the premier, and then there's 3 vice premiers. And one of those vice premiers is the only person who's been seen as a potential successor to Xi Jinping, who is, one second, who is, let me look here. Dear God. Wen, yeah, I think it's Wang. No. I'm just trying to find the name of the guy who's supposed to be a successor. Yeah, here we go. I think it's Hu Xinhua is who it's supposed to be, but let me just double check this, okay? Sorry, I'm really, yeah. So I think
we're
some
all
people
learning here, so don't
yeah,
worry.
I think Hu Xinhua is the vice premier of the state council, and he's someone who's been he's one of the only people who'd be like eligible wise, like in terms of age and stuff when you consider. So he is viewed sort of favorably, right? But it's like we know in China that often leaders have very, very ambivalent relationships with their chosen successors because of the instability of the political system in general, right? We can go back to Mao, right? Of the 3 potential successors he appointed, 2 of them were violently sort of persecuted by the party at some point. One of them, when Mao mysteriously disappeared, and we never know.
Yeah.
In a plane apparently fleeing to Russia. Yeah, so that's happening. But what supposedly has happened, what Xi is trying to do right now is he's trying to get a 3rd term in 2022, right? And I think that requires a vote or some kind of ratification. I look that up, 1 second. I just want to see I know he's looking for a 3rd term in 2022. I just want to see the exact procedure. Let's see here. For the love of God. Yeah, wait. Yeah, so the personnel changes of 2022. So the Chinese, like the Communist Party, will hold its 20th National People's Congress in 2022. So here it just says there's possible he'll be dismissed by internal Chinese Communist Party factions and his political power neutered. Xi.
The premier?
No, Xi Jinping, the general secretary. So this is the issue, right? And I'm not I don't have all the exact details about this, and it may be quite fluid. But the point is that he's trying to get a 3rd term for 2022, and mostly he has a lot of authority, but there are fissures, right, in the government. And I think a lot of you got to look at what's been happening the last few years. On one hand, China's growth has increased tremendously. There's the possibility of a big long-term payoff in terms of Belt and Road, right?
Yeah.
There's been initiatives that have been devoted to curbing corruption that have been somewhat successful, environmental initiatives and so on. On the other hand, right, there has been issues, right? Any country has issues, of course, but I guess the point is that by ruling in a way that's somewhat autocratic, Xi has made himself a real target, right? Because in a sense, he has to take more responsibility for anything that messes up. So a couple of issues that have come up. One, obviously China eventually had a very, very rapid and efficient response to COVID, but at first we know there was concealment, right, of some of the issues that were going on. There was bureaucratic mishandling of that, and to a lot of people that attested to a lack of institutional transparency that has not been addressed. Right, the fact that local officials still feel a compulsion to lie about important issues, right, because they feel they're going to be penalized, right, just for reporting these things, right, And that's not a good culture too. Like people should feel like, they'll be rewarded, right, for being responsive and, bringing this information forth. And of course that was a national controversy in China as well, right? Because, you had like doctors who were like whistleblowers and getting the whole thing, right? Who some of whom were one of them died, while they were in this process, not from the party, but they got COVID apparently. But there were people who were sort of hushed up, and it turned into a national scandal as well, because it offended a lot of people, their sense of what's right. I mean, it's a big deal, this health issue, and I think also doctors, we tend to think of them in terms of Hippocratic oath and so on, as in China as elsewhere, as it's like they're supposed to have a certain distance from the immediate political situation in terms of this is a health issue, I'm going to say it.
Yeah, right? They don't though, but that's another topic.
Well, maybe not, but the idea is they should, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of respect for doctors in China, right, because of their how central the establishment of medical infrastructure was also to the legacy of the Chinese Communist Party. Mm-hmm. Right, one of the great figures, right, in China who is very, very valorized is Norman Bethune. I might have said this, but he's a Canadian from Greyfurst, near where I'm from. And he was the first one to develop. He was a Canadian. He fought in the Spanish Civil War, and then he went out to fight in China with Mao in the old days, Red Star over China days. Mm-hmm. And he was he developed mobile blood transfusion units for the first time. So in MASH, when they have the camp, mm-hmm. Yeah, like those units were like developed by him, like the technology to transfuse blood on a mobile basis. And he died. He got a blood infection, ironically, and he died. And after he died, Mao wrote this like effusively praiseful letter, and he was like, what compels someone, like, to relinquish, like all the privileges associated with, like, being a well-paid official, or a well-paid professional, in a first world country, to relinquish all of that and to come here and put their life on the line, and as we know, to die. Why would you do that? Mm-hmm. Right. And he said this guy is like the archetype, right, of like the new man that we're trying to create, right, in China. And that was that letter was assigned and mandatory for all students in China. I don't know if it still is today. For a long time, everybody had to read that. So actually, where I'm from, it was funny because a few years ago we had a conservative government, and not that there's much of a difference between, because we don't really have like even like a nominally socialist party that can govern in Canada. We have a conservative party and a liberal party. And we had a conservative party a few years ago, and they went and they constructed like an elaborate memorial to Norman Bethune in his hometown, like, which is funny, right? Because he's this Maoist communist icon. But it was to attract tourism, right? Because there are people who come out here, to Toronto to do business, and they want to go, or even they're in Canada and they're like, oh, we got to go see that memorial. Because like there's only, it's funny like how countries get, how they're circumscribed in the popular imaginary of other countries. Like Canada's not, we don't have a city that is as well installed or lodged within the global imaginary as like Los Angeles or something, Right. So often it's a little weird and incidental. Like it's like there are tons of Japanese tourists, for example, who go to Prince Edward Island to see the Green Gables. I don't know if you know about this.
I don't know what that is.
I know what it is. Okay. This is just a random digression, but in Canada, in the 19th century, there were books by a female author, Lucy Maud Montgomery, and she wrote these books about a girl named Anne of Green Gables, who was like this girl with red hair, who was like overexpressive, I guess, and she got drunk on like strawberry wine, growing up in this rural island in eastern Canada in the Atlantic Ocean. And it's just like huge in Japan, and like every summer, like tons of Japanese tourists come. So I guess what I mean is, it's like it's quite it's a bit culturally particular, too, right, in terms of tourism. Yeah.
Did you know that there's a whole analog, of course, in Cuba, right, with Che Guevara? He was actually described as. Oh, sorry.
With his house, you mean like you can go, people go to like the sanctuary of his home?
I mean, in the sense that he was, after his death, trying to remember as this archetype also of a man who abandoned all privilege. He was a doctor, right? From Argentina.
Yeah.
He didn't have to be a guerrilla fighter in Cuba, but he did.
Of course.
Right?
Yeah, no,
and he was literally also called Nuevo Hombre, new man also. Yeah. So I think it's really funny. right?
Yeah. No, that's funny for sure. And I think it's funny when people go to like Che Guevara's, like, because he has like his house in Cuba, and it's like this really humble, abode, domicile. And I think it's very funny though, because it's like I understand that, he like how much time he actually spent living in that house. I don't know, maybe like a year or two. But like,
yeah, probably.
It's like, I think if you actually were to survey where he grew up in like Argentina, it's probably very nice, because I think he came from a fairly wealthy family.
Yeah.
So. It's like Mao came from wealthy farmers, right? So it's petit bourgeois, a petit rural bourgeois. I mean, it's a peasant society, so it's a little hard to equate. But so I wanted to talk. So I was saying, Xi is trying to get. My point was, Xi's trying to get another term in 2022. But there's an internal opposition to this. There's people who don't want it. So I said one failure has been about COVID, right? Another failure has been a perceived potential failure. It depends who you are. Another potential failure has been in soft power, right? China's global perceptions of China have declined in the past few years because of all the saber rattling that's going wrong. And a lot of people see it as like, in terms, they talk about this like wolf warrior diplomacy, right? I get that's off the film Wolf Warrior 2, which was such a big hit, which I saw. Have you seen Wolf Warrior 2?
No.
Oh, you got to see it.
I will.
Oh yeah, no, you should. It's about like it's basically about like
Super Cup or something.
An African country that collapses into like civil war, and there's like a kind of like hardened Chinese like ex military there working as like private security or something. I don't know. I forget the details. And he has to like rescue the Chinese who are like marooned there, and ultimately deal like crucial blows to like the sort of the murderous African terrorist group that's attempting to seize power in the nation. And then it ends with like an image of a Chinese passport, and it's like, Chinese people, don't fear. Wherever you go, the Chinese Communist Party will protect you. So it's actually there's this in the end where they're going through a jeep. And you have the Chinese people in the jeep, and the one guy's holding the Chinese flag, and it's just blazing in the wind, right? And they're just cruising through this. So it's quite interesting. But it also tells you, it's interesting when you watch the film, because it tells you something about perceptions of Africa in China. Some of the images in the film, it shows him like they're out there like playing soccer on the beach. This really kind of ramshackle environment. And they're all like drinking, like, they're having drinking contests, and of course, Chinese people drink a lot, I think. They're just going back and I think what often, right, in terms of people leaving to set up businesses in Africa, leaving to work as private security, so on and so forth, infrastructure projects, I think it's a lot of men too. And remember, China has a surplus of men, right? Because of infanticide, right? And there's a misperception about the infanticide in China, because a lot of people say, oh, well, the infanticide is a consequence of the one-child policy, right? Now, I think it's very hard to discern these things statistically, but I will say that I was talking to a friend of mine, Rachel, who lived in China, and she told me that, in fact, infanticide has always been a problem in China, but they didn't collect statistics for a long time. And when they implemented the one-child policy, there was a huge drive to collect more elaborate statistics about childbirth, about natality, and that made the demographic patterns with respect to infanticide more visible, right? Does that make sense? Yeah. So which film is this? Oh yeah, Sinopharm. So he got the Chinese vaccine. Okay, yeah, there we go.
Great.
The Palestinian flag with the Chinese vaccine. There you go. I heard it's not as good as the Pfizer vaccine, but I hope you hold up. But hey, it's accessible to the third world more than the other vaccines. So kudos to that.
Yeah.
But actually, Hamza's in Pakistan, if I'm not mistaken. And I don't know if you know this, but Pakistan has, if you look at different countries, Pakistan has, I think, like the highest favorability ratings of China in the entire world because of the mega infrastructure projects that have been taken out under BRI. So, but I just want to say, with the film, by the way, is Wolf Warrior 2. I think there's a lot of, and so I said you have this demographic disparity of more men than women, right? And I think a lot of, you also have something like, a situation in which I think export markets have declined, since 2008, and especially they're eligible to be hit because of COVID, right? So there's a need to find other, channels for investment. And I think you have a situation where you have a lot of like relatively young men in China, like going to Africa, right? Many of them, I think, probably like working class, right? I don't think you do that if you came from like the most. This is usually how it goes, right? You sort of send them, you send the great unwashed right abroad, right, to further your national interest. But I think you have a lot of them going to African countries, and I think for a lot of people, and remember that in the West, well, I don't need to tell you this, Ernesto, but in the West, we're very privileged in terms of how many countries we can go visit. I mean, a lot of countries don't have that same access, right? But in terms of visas and so on. But I just
right.
Yeah. But I think for a lot of people, it's like a lot of these young guys going there. And I don't want to paint it all with a rosy hue, but I think for a lot of them, it's like it's a huge thing, right? To go over to Africa and see what it's like is like very exciting. A little freaky, probably, because some of these countries, it's like you see someone with a gun, it's not necessarily the police, right? That could be America, for that matter. But I mean, I think a lot of I think for a lot of people, it's like an experience of their lives to sort of go over and have the opportunity to see another place, right?
I thought you meant that they went to seek job opportunities. Is that not what you meant? No.
That's what I meant. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
No, but what I meant is that like I think for a lot of people, like like it's seeking job opportunities, but I think for a lot of people, I don't want to say it's always easy. Like maybe most people, I'm sure, would probably rather stay, but nevertheless, I think for a lot of people, it really gives them a chance to see other places, right? Because like if you look at the situation that if you look at the wealth of a lot of African countries, I mean, it's more akin to where China was several decades ago. Right. I mean, if you're talking about younger people, younger men in particular, I think there were a lot of people going over. A lot of them would never have seen that. They would never have grown up with that. They wouldn't have. So I think, even if this is all sort of mediated through, it's all mediated through public infrastructure, private interest, whatever. I think for a lot of people, it gives them a larger window into understanding the post-colonial world as well, or just playing soccer and taking shots at the beach on your weekends. I mean, whatever, right? Like, maybe both. Hopefully both. So I'm, but I'd be very interested. I mean, I was talking to Jan Bandari, and he said that he's involved in the mineral industry, right? So he goes all over, and he said that he went to the airport in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and he said you'd think it's like China. It's like 90% of the people in the airport are Chinese. Right. So I think there's a lot of huge flows of people, huge flows of capital, going on at this point. But in any case, so we digress, because what I was saying is that I'm getting off topic here. To recapitulate, what I was trying to say is that there are certain dissatisfactions with Xi's leadership, right? So the first dissatisfaction, I was going to say, I think there's some things about COVID, right, about the way it was concealed. The second, and maybe more significant, insofar as it can be more easily attributed to him, has to do with the aggressive stance he's taken to diplomacy, right? Inevitably, something like BRI, which is a big initiative, and we'll talk about that in a minute, that was going to ruffle feathers, right? Because, it's a major expansion of China's, trade potential, right, with other countries in the world. But obviously, Xi's taken a strong stance. He's been like, China's here. We've arrived. Don't fuck with us, right? That's the way he's done it. And I think there's a lot of people who feel that it could have been done in a more delicate way. I don't know if that's true, right? I think, in terms of how Xi's been behaving, I think, there has been aggressive responses, but I wouldn't say that I wouldn't say that China's been predominantly in the position of like, attacking the West. It's the other way around. Most of the time it's been the West instigating these attacks against China, and then China strongly responding, right?
Yeah, and if anything, they're very hypocritical attacks, because China and the West both affected lockdowns for COVID, which is something that not every country did. Mexico did not affect lockdowns for COVID, which is a controversial issue. But when we're talking, facts on the ground, having lockdown means that if you're working class and you have to stay 3 hours, late, and then you have to go back, you're at risk of getting arrested or getting fined. Well,
that's something. But you have certificates, right, for working late.
Well, sure, yeah, but what about informal workers, right, or subcontracted workers, right?
Yeah,
there's a lot of gray spots when it comes to
Yeah,
law.
even me, like as an immigrant in France, I'm like way more cautious about that, you know. And I'm
Right,
not
right.
like an illegal immigrant or like, you know, like
Mhm.
some like sub-proletariat, you know, Russian or something without a visa. Yeah.
Yeah, and even with lockdowns, I mean, you and I'm sure you know that, you know, the privileged people will still party, right?
Yeah.
They will.
Mhm.
I mean, it's just a fine. Just pay the fine, right?
Yeah, of
Have
course.
your
Yeah,
party
yeah.
and
Which is
drink.
why I always say I like what they do in Finland, because I think in
Mhm.
Finland they make the fines a percentage of your income, which I like so much.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
great. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I heard in Finland there was a German CEO who's now like an exile from Finland. Like he refuses to go back to Finland because he was pulled over and he got like an 11 million euro fine or something like that. So, and he's just like, I'm not going back to Finland. I'm sorry, it's not worth 11 million
Personal,
euros.
yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, no, those are all issues. I don't obviously look. I don't think, you know, the criticism that's emanating out of the West. I don't think it. You know, I don't think it has anything to do with what we say it has to do with.
Yeah, that's the point.
Yeah.
It's just trying to push political pressure,
Yeah,
where,
absolutely. Yeah.
you know, putting your spoon where it's not supposed to go. I don't know. That's a saying in Spanish, but I don't know how to
The real
translate
thing,
it.
the real thing, I think, what it's about is it's about the idea that, you know, China shouldn't do now. Again, I'm not saying that all these things are good things, but I'm just looking at the balance of it. I think the real idea here is that China shouldn't do what the West has done.
Yeah.
Right? And I think in a way you see it makes it in a strange way like easy for the Western left to support that line in a way, because for actually very different reasons. I think, you know, the Western left is like China shouldn't do what the West does. You know, so when they're sort of cynically condemned by the West, right, for doing what the West does, for you know, pressing towards a more multipolar dispensation, right, to asserting themselves in the world, you know, then the Western left is like, yeah, they shouldn't be doing that, right? You know, the motives aren't always inspected so much, right? I think sometimes people are too hasty to take these things at face value. You know, Uyghur repression or genocide, as the case may be. You know, 5G. You know, whatever. You know, like, and the thing, you know, the thing about it, of course, is it's like in every case. And again, I'm not saying that what China's doing is good, right? What I'm talking about is the moral authority to condemn, and I want to be clear about that. When it comes down to these allegations, I mean, look at the United States support for Israel and what's going on right now. You know, like look at the war in Afghanistan, look at the war in Iraq. I mean, like with the Uyghur stuff, like we're supposed to believe the United States are like champions of Muslim lives right now, like Muslim religious freedom, Muslim lives. That's what they're really invested in. I mean, everything they've done, like in the past 20 years and more, right? You know, probably go back a century, right?
Yeah.
You know, look at the 70s, the big up people. Everything they've done, but particularly in the last 20 years, but before, would attest to the fact that they don't give a fuck about Muslim lives, right? Yeah. You know, and now we're supposed to believe, you know, innocent, right? Believe that, you know, they're really invested in this issue and they're genuinely concerned about this ostensible genocide. And I'm not saying there isn't repression. I don't think the genocide label is just. I'll say that. Repression is another issue, right? And a more nebulous term. But they're very, very clear. You know, if you look at you know, international law, there are very clear terms stipulated regarding what a genocide is, right? So, you know, and it's not easy. You know, you have to prove that you know, people are being killed, and you have to prove that a group is being targeted for specifically ethnic reasons, right? As opposed to, say, there's a disproportionate percentage of state enemies in said group or something like that, right? So again, I'm not licensing any of this stuff. I'm not saying it's good. That's not my point, right? I'm saying that there is a stringent definition of this that was established. And look, the U.S. own State Department, you know this story. Mike Pompeo asked the U.S. State Department to look into this issue, right? Just as the trade war was you know, going on, right? Ming Wanzhou was arrested in Canada. He asked the U.S. State Department to look into it, and they said, look, we don't have, you know, Adrian Zenz made a passing reference, you know, this, you know, crazy homophobic, you know, religious zealot, right, who's now apparently an expert on all things China, in spite of having no real social science background. You know, Mike Pompeo asked the U.S. State Department to look into it, and the U.S. State Department said, look, we don't have proof of that. You know, they're lawyers, so don't have proof of that, right? Pompeo said, I don't care, right? We're going forward with it regardless, right? Then Biden did it, right? Then Australia did it, then Canada did it, then the EU did it, right? And then it's purely political, right? And again, I'm not saying that it's good what's happening there. That's not what I'm saying, right? I'm saying that this distinction, this allegation, and the way it's been weaponized in an international political context is not about that, right? Mm-hmm. That's what I'm saying. So you have that. The stuff about data and 5G. I mean, like NSA, Edward Snowden.
Yeah.
That's Jesus Christ.
That's his conspiracy, pretty much.
The stuff about debt trap diplomacy, neocolonialism in Africa. Give me a break, right?
It's pretty ironic. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like literally everything they're accusing China of doing, they've done much worse.
Yeah.
Every single one. It's like the West has done 10 times worse, right? Now, I'm not saying that it's good China does those things, right? Because I think if you're 10% as bad as the West or 20, that's still a problem, right? But still, you're 20 times as bad as the West, right? So it's these are all complex issues, right? So I think that's kind of the diplomatic situation we were talking about. But the point is, in China, in any case, there's a lot of people who feel that maybe this could have been dealt with in a way that was more diplomatic. Is that true? It's complicated, right? Because maybe
it's probably true, but
maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. Sorry, what are you saying?
Whatever. I'm saying that maybe it might be true, but it's talking after the facts.
I just feel like for example, like when you're accused of genocide, it's like, what do you say? Like, I think it's very difficult. It's a very difficult situation. Like, what do you do when an allegation is that damning? What do you do, right? Do you say, oh yes, we were doing that. Let's invite all the international reporters so they can run stories about it and very publicly close these facilities, right? Because there are facilities. Whatever's going on there are facilities. What do you do with it, right? Because that would be, those kind of actions. I think if you look at like the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? For example, those kind of actions signal the weakness of the state in a way that really makes you vulnerable, right? Including to internal dissent, right? Even if one looked at the situation and said, well, there's repression, we want to improve it, right? It wouldn't necessarily be a good idea to make a public spectacle out of it in that way, right? Because it would seem like you're capitulating to international pressure, right? But then, if you ignore it, people are still going to attack you, right? If you capitulate spectacularly in the international media, you look very weak, right? This is what I'm saying, that the gravity and the nature of the allegations are such that I feel like you really have no choice but to respond. And then if you look at the impetus for why these kind of allegations are being leveled, it has everything to do with China's broad geopolitical ascent, right? So it's like, it's a hard thing, and I think it's a way to, like, I'm not saying Xi's done everything right, but I think maybe some of these people, I think, maybe they're kidding themselves a little bit about the capacity when people have, an ulterior motive in terms of bringing forth these allegations. Like, do you really think that if you like earnestly address them, like, we really like you guys, like, is that going to diffuse the threat of China's geopolitical ascent? Is that going to stop it? Right? I don't know. Maybe he could have dealt with things a bit more diplomatically. Right?
Maybe.
But maybe not. Right? I think there's a certain reason to his strategy, because he's just like, people are going to do this no matter what. It's inevitable, right? Like we read in the last text, right? It gets harder the more, the stronger we get, not easier, right? People are going to do this no matter what, and you have to project strength, right? And there's no amount of self-prostration, or apologia, that's going to get people off your back at this point, because you're coming up, it's like a few years, it's going to be the biggest economy in the world, right? And you're going to get criticized a lot. You have other blocks attacking you. That's the way it is, right? I guess my only thing about people criticizing him in that way, and I'm not saying that they responded to everything perfectly, but my only thing about people criticizing him that way is I think maybe they're a little bit naive. Like in the 80s, it was a little more possible for China to like fly under the radar because like they weren't, they were an aside to the larger conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Right. And they were able to kind of, ally themselves, partially with the United States, which provided them, immunity from a lot of international criticism and exclusion from different forums. they kind of they had their own kind of little Cold War with the Soviet Union, but it never really elevated into a major military confrontation, and they were able to keep, I think from the early 70s onward, when they were elevated to the UN Security Council, they were able to keep like something of a bit of a lower profile, right? But the very nature of China's ascent, I think it just makes it hard to immunize yourself from criticism to that degree, right? So I guess I think maybe some people who say, well, he's been very aggressive, it's like, it's just you're just dealt a very different hand than like Deng was, like that, like and then if you look at some of these situations, like again, terrible violence, in Tiananmen, it's not like, if you look at like Deng responded, but just to compare the responses, again, I think it's horrible. Just to compare the responses, Deng responded very strongly on that issue, right? Which was one in which the international criticism was loud enough that he couldn't just evade it, right? And was also being weaponized by the West to some extent. He responded very strongly on that, right? He wasn't like, oh, we love you, like everything, I say, we got some problems, it'll be okay. It's just not really a response you can do when people are like coming right at you, right? You gotta, sometimes you gotta respond, right? And that goes for any country, by the way. And it's not about whether the things in question are good or bad or any of that, right? We're just talking strategy and diplomacy here, right? At a certain point, you can't avoid that, right? What do you think about that? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think we should always try to look a little bit closer and not get fooled and get carried away by criticism that comes from, I guess, bad faith actors. I know that that's even an infamous strawman in terms of inter-communist conflict, but my point is that sometimes you have bourgeois interests who are trying to appeal to civil liberties, and to just liberal values in general, in a way that pretty much only benefits their private agenda.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's. I think that's one thing that you see that Deng was actually very astute about, right? If you read his writings, and he made it very clear, right? He was like, he's like, he basically said like he would say very explicitly, like, there are criticisms you can respond to and ones you can, and if people aren't, if people are just out to undermine you, if the allegation they're making has an ulterior motive, right, and they'll settle at nothing but sort of like, the tremendous weakening or collapse of your regime, then, how do you can't respond to that faithfully, right? There's no way to do it. So I think Deng, one thing about him, and again, I'm not trying to trivialize any of this stuff like Tiananmen, terrible violence. I think one thing about Deng was he was very sort of sophisticated about saying, is this in good faith or is this in bad faith, right? And responding accordingly. And I think this is part of the paradox of Deng's personality, because people often wonder, like, how is it that Deng, because he had a reputation for a certain benevolence in how he dealt with people. There was a quite a diplomatic spirit in some ways. Tibet, we're going to have these big conferences. We'll house the Dalai Lama. Hong Kong can keep the same system. We're not going to interfere. Taiwan, if you join us, you can keep your government. We won't do anything. Let's rehabilitate the old party members who were persecuted, and so on. Right. But Deng also could be very, very authoritarian. Right. And again, going back to his wartime record, I said, apparently, I think there was a village that was pretty much like wiped out, right? And then you go to Tiananmen Square, which is different also because it wasn't a civil war even, right? That. And I think sometimes the question is, how could Deng be, I think it confuses people because there's a certain narrative about him that was constructed in the West, right? Deng, he's more like us, he's more amenable to Western liberal values and so on. And that as it may be, I think, there was a real discrepancy in how he responded to things based on what he perceived the motivation of the difficulty to be, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that kind of captures the dual character of his personality. So all I want to say is Xi is seeking a third term in 2022. I think a couple of weeks ago they had like a meeting. What is it, the Louis Quang, or I'm trying to remember what the name of it is. they had a meeting anyway, an important meeting a couple weeks ago, and the rules were revised, and I think now he has more power to dismiss people below him. So some people are wondering if he's going to try to dismiss Li Keqiang. I already said that the premier, apparently some of his speeches were actually like the public broadcaster wouldn't run them and stuff. Okay. So there is some jousting. The thought is that Li Keqiang is connected to a clique of people who don't want Xi to get a third term. So they're trying to build a base of support within the party to stop that from happening, right? And the allegations they're using have to do with the aggressive approach to diplomacy, I think, and the slow initial response to COVID, I think, are two of the major charges. There are probably others, of course, but certainly others. But it shows the tensions within the system. And I think, more generally, the fact that in China, I think if you want to understand like the basic dynamic of the system, right? It's like, on one hand, you had, in the Deng era, you had this, certain people became tremendously enriched, right, in the society. A lot of it through corruption as well. Arguably most of the super rich. I think probably most of the super rich is through corruption, right? Yeah. And China, by the way, I believe they still have relatively low wealth inequality, but high income inequality, which is a bit different. But a lot of people got very rich, and you had the growth of the sort of nouveau riche class, and growth in the private sector the public sector was growing, but growth in the private sector was going a lot faster, right? So for a lot of people, I think a lot of the sort of nouveau riche class, a lot of them were like, well, we have the momentum, right? We're getting stronger and stronger, right? People like, Jiang Zemin, for example, were very amenable to our interests. We're getting stronger and stronger. It's only a matter of time before, we sort of seize more control over the political structures and kind of liberalize the economy, and so on, and become proper members of like the international capitalist class, right? Sorry, what are you saying? Yeah, created a bit of cringe there. Yeah, a bit of cringe. Yeah. Well, it's a dream, right? Because they've been in, these people, like they have a lot of money, but they're enchained within a political structure that restricts them in certain respects, right? Compared to rich people in a lot of other countries, right?
Yeah. We had our wave of neoliberalization in Mexico, and it also created its nouveau riche. It just happened around the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s.
Yeah, well, it was different. Yeah. It was different in China because wealth inequality was so low before that. And it's interesting to go back to that quote where Deng says, I said it's taken so regularly out of context, that quote where Deng says, to be rich is glorious, right? Because if you look at what he says after that, right, he's like, but like to be rich means something different in our system because like it's about the construction of wealth that can be used for like collective, it's really collective wealth in the last instance, and frankly we don't want a new bourgeoisie to arise. That's not our goal. And then he later adds, he says like, what are we talking about when we say rich here? He said like, in China to be considered rich, you'd have like $2,000 or $3,000 US. He said like, do you consider that rich? We're still a very poor country, right? So these are pretty significant additions to that original remark, which is so taken out of context. I mean, The Economist just puts that quote there, right, with a banner of him, right? And they're like, great icons, Deng Xiaoping, to be rich is glorious. It's like, well, I don't know if that's really conforms with like the ethic of The Economist on the whole. But in any case, right, you can argue that a new bourgeoisie did emerge, right, because of spectacular private sector growth and corruption, right? Don't dismiss the importance of corruption. So in that respect, perhaps Deng was wrong. But in one sense, he was right? And in the sense that he would have been right, you would say that even today, compared to other capitalist countries, the bourgeoisie do not have direct control over political structures.
Yeah.
Right? Well, that raises the question, who does have control over political structures? Are they poor? Common workers? Well, that's an interesting question. The people who have the highest control over political structures are mostly people who descend from the revolutionary leaders, right? See Xi Jinping's whole career. It hasn't been in the private sector, but in the public sector. Okay, so then we have a question, which is very interesting. There's been some international, the Panama Papers and so on, that show that Xi's family has a lot of money, a lot, right? I don't like, because I think a lot of this stuff is speculative. I don't want to get too much into naming figures, but let's say probably collectively at least tens of millions, right, of dollars. And there's been talk, Hong Kong property markets and other things like that. Mm-hmm. So if his family is mostly a political family, now I'd have to go through it and look at, because actually I think his dad married, like, if I'm not mistaken, was his dad who married like 3 times or something? Anyway, these are big family, right? But that usually still doesn't get you tens of millions of dollars. So it's not enough. Like it's usually, it's not like usually the most successful of my 8 children has tens of millions. It's still good. Mm-hmm. Again, his father was one of the people like on the ground floor, right? We talked about this, right? Like he was one of the early, and I think crucially, his dad was the head of the SEZ in Shenzhen. Mm-hmm. And Deng went to liberate it. Now, I do not want to make any allegations against anybody. I don't want to do that, right? I don't want to do that. I don't know, right? But given how rampant corruption was in the system, to the point where early on, like there wasn't even, there were loopholes in the law. It wasn't even illegal in a lot of cases. It became a de facto component of the business culture, right? Is it possible, and this is what I'm saying, like, is it possible that in China, I don't think, in terms of powerful families in China, like, does anyone not have their hand in the pot? And certainly anyone coming up in that era, which was Wild West in terms of the business ethos, I don't know, maybe they all did, mm-hmm. Right? I just don't know if it's really possible to completely distance yourself from that culture, right? I think maybe everyone was kind of on the take, right? And so it may be the case that even should someone come along and say, well, we're launching a campaign against corruption, that if you go back and look historically, at least, right, that you wouldn't be able to totally extricate them from that, right? Does that make sense? Yeah, because it's so pervasive. So the question becomes like, again, so these people aren't necessarily poor, right? I don't think they're all rich, but they're not necessarily poor, right? A lot of them are spectacularly rich, right? If you look at, so this is the thing. It's like, through, obviously there's been some kind of capitalization going on, right? If you look at people within the political class who are very elevated, they are not the leaders of the private sector, right? They're not Jack Ma necessarily, right? The leaders of the private sector are subordinated to them. But I'm saying for them to be wealthy, for them to have large amounts of money in bank accounts and so on, there's been some kind of capitalization. And that raises questions, doesn't it? Right? Mm-hmm. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't want to present them as totally totally separate, completely 100% separate from the capitalist class. But I do think there's a difference, right? Because I think that, if you look at the whole, landscape in China, it's like, why is it that Jack Ma is being censored by the leadership when he's the guy with the most money, right? It's like, like, did they do that to Bezos in America? Mm-hmm. Did they do that to Bill Gates?
Musk?
No. Yeah. Musk? Yeah. No. These guys are like feted, right? They're like gods, right? So, So how is it that you take like the richest guy in a country like that, right? And he's being, they can kind of toss him in the void, right? And what it attests to is even if, many people on the Politburo side of money, what it attests to is a gap, right, between the wealthiest members of the new bourgeoisie and the actual political leadership, even if they are not, say, poor. Mm-hmm. Right. And I think more and more the strategy has been, because like the thing is, the threat becomes greater to the continuity of governance of the party as the private sector becomes more and more enriched. Right. Because they get more and more resources to put at their disposal to try to change the structure of the system. Right. And I think in many ways, if you look at Xi and what he's been doing, it's all about, and it's very interesting, right? I read a Diplomatic Cables background on him, and there's some interesting information on it. Like, apparently at one point he was really into Buddhist mysticism and stuff, But one thing it said was, it said he has like a deeply elitist mentality, in the sense that he believes that like these people, and like, elitism is complicated, right? Like, I think his designs are more redistributive in a lot of ways than certain of his peers, right? But elitist in the sense that he sort of sees the, we could go back to Mao's, theories of internal bourgeois. Right? He sort of sees like the oligarchy, or these sort of, traditional families, post-revolutionary families, as being the rightful heirs of government. Mm-hmm. Right. And he doesn't, he's opposed to these encroachments by the nouveau riche, right? Who are like, we should run things now. right? Now, if you look at his governance, I think a lot of it has really been about trying to stave that off, right? Why does he go in like some of his first talks and he says, well, we need SOEs, state-owned enterprises. We need to also improve their management culture and make them more lucrative, right? You know, you look at these huge initiatives like Belt and Road. He's taking money from the Chinese private sector, right? You know, and well, you know, public sector is producing it as well, right? But the point is, he's also taking money from the private sector, right? And he's putting it into you know, major infrastructure projects abroad that are designed to enhance sort of the authority of China and its government and its soft power, right? You know, so I'm not saying that, of course, in the last instance, we can trace all these things back to the economy anyway, right? But what I'm saying is that in the, I think he's sort of waging a battle, right, against the immediate enrichment, immediate further enrichment of the, you know, sort of the nouveau riche in China, right, and trying to kind of usurp some of their authority and their wealth, right, and place it in the service of the government, and to try to, I think it's all about, in many ways, it's all about this political class in China trying to maintain their hold and power. How are they going to do that, right? Well, one way they're going to do that in order to rally the population, right, because they're not a big group, we know, right? Maybe we're talking about a few hundred people. They're not a big group, right? So what are they going to do? Well, you know, they're also seizing upon the resentment of the public towards some of these people, right? You know, when, you know, they said like a few years ago, and it's very interesting how the climate has changed, and Xi has played a role in facilitating that change. A few years ago, people were, the way they saw Jack Ma was totally different. They were like, Jack Ma, he's a very innovative guy, you know, like he's the kind of person we
need. He did this whole concert thing where he dressed up as Michael Jackson.
Yeah. But they were saying that when Jack Ma, you know, when he made those statements, when he was, you know, sort of under quasi, you know, sort of went hiding in his own home for a couple of weeks.
He
was ordered, to do that. He wasn't put in a gulag or something. It was ridiculous stories. I said, in China, you can be censored if you're like Bill Gates, but they don't put you in a gulag. It's not quite at that level. But when he was censored, whatever, you know, they, when he was censored, you know, people like on Weibo, like on social media and stuff in China, they were like, oh yeah, you know, Jack Ma's awful, right? He's like a vampire. He's like sucking his wealth off the people, you know, he's like a public traitor. You know, it's a totally different kind of rhetoric. So what after Bo Xilai, I was saying with Bo Xilai, the sort of left populist who was canned, right, and thrown into prison. After Bo Xilai, I think particularly that sort of signaled the potency of taking advantage of this kind of left populist, neo-Maoist kind of sentiment in China. So in terms of this, achieving this goal of strengthening, you know, the political, the grip on power, you know, of the political class, I think one thing Xi is looking to do is, you know, obviously he doesn't want to undermine, you know, China's sort of Keynesian economic dispensation, which has been very germane to growth. So he's not going to, you know, rout that class entirely, right? But his basic goal is to get them on the defensive, right? You know, through you know, extracting their wealth, through strengthening the public sector, through you know, kind of playing to, you know, kind of neo-Maoist leftist populist sentiments, you know, among the country. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So that's how I would, you know, it's interesting. And also I want to add Thomas Jones. We had an interesting discussion in the group. Thomas Jones, he said, well, for me, you know, I'd say that China is, you know, I think he had an interesting perspective. He said, like, I would call it state capitalist, but I think like it's still doing better than most structures. And you know, like without wading into that debate, I would note that China barely, you know, even in official terms, it's not a big stretch because China barely sees itself as socialist, right? Primary stage of socialism till 2049, I believe. So it's not even like, it's not even, you know, there's a level of self-awareness, right? They're not like, so I think, you know, in many ways you could say, yeah, like state capitalist, it's like, but that's better than like just capitalist. So, right? It's like, it is
in a way, yeah.
Well, I think provided that it's pursued within, you know, sort of a left model, then I think, you know, it's you know, and I think that's been that model, you know, the Maoist period as well, clearly, but I think that model's served China very well in many ways. I think the great question that comes up is how do you go beyond that, right? You know, and that's a very difficult question because I don't think it's something that's just going to magically happen. right? I think there has to be an actual organization. There has to actually be like a political will that's mustered to create that, right, amongst the masses. And it's not, I don't believe that it's just going to singularly emanate from the authority of its, leading cabal, right?
No, I doubt it. Yeah.
I think some of them, I think like even Xi to some extent, I think some of them are quite amenable to that vision. Probably a lot aren't. But in any case, I think that, there's a certain inertia amongst ruling bureaucracies that makes them incapable of effecting these kind of transitions, right? So I think it will need public advocacy and support, right, in order to be accomplished. Okay, well, we have the text today, but I just wanted to give a bit of background on these issues. And I also want to say just lastly about BRI. So that was launched in 2013, Belt and Road, by the way. Enormous initiative, stretching right into the Mediterranean. They got Italy and Greece on there, right? The port of Piraeus, right? Which is a really central point for that. But I just wanted to, now you've got several continents. Some countries have refused to join Belt and Road, right? Japan is not part of Belt and Road. South Korea is not part of Belt and Road. The U.S. really strengthened Belt and Road. In fact, when Trump pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, right? Because the U.S. was in a position potentially to create a competitive trade structure and to write the rules of trade in Asia, but Trump's withdrawal hurt them in that respect. And now I understand that there's the possibility of Belt and Road being sort of zombie-like revived under Biden, right? But it may be too little too late. China's made huge inroads with Belt and Road just in the Trump era, right? In terms of the credibility of it. Now, one thing to understand about Belt and Road as well, again, enormous infrastructure investments in Africa, other places, Pakistan, all over. One thing to understand about Belt and Road as well is this costs a lot of money.
Yeah.
It's very expensive. And right now, a lot of people, it's funny because in the West, we would say like, neocolonialism, blah, blah. A lot of people in China, like in the private sector, even Jan Bhandari, who works in India, I talked to him about this. And Jan Bhandari, he was like, how are they ever going to he's like, they give money to places in Africa. Like these countries aren't even like maintaining the infrastructure, it's like, it costs a lot of money, often they're just doing it for free, it's not even being monetized. It's not being maintained. I just don't see it working. So it's kind of ironic, right? Because one of the most common complaints, I think, being voiced against it is that China's not doing enough, right, to actually extract goods in turn, right, when they pursue these projects. I'm not saying that's always the case, but you look at like in Ethiopia, they went and built like all kinds of stuff for nothing, right? They're just gonna build some stuff, right? Of course, nothing's for nothing, right? They were hoping that if Ethiopia discovered oil, which they did a few years later, that they would get privileged access to it, and they did, right? But my understanding is that was never even at the level of a formal agreement, right? It was just that they built a lot of credibility in the country. The thing about Belt and Road, though, I looked at the overall. So Belt and Road costs, I think it costs something like $1 trillion a year to service, right? Like, let me take a look at. I want to take a look at China annual GDP. I want to see if that could be correct. Wait, let me see. Yeah. So in 2019, China's GDP was 14.34 trillion. Yeah. So I think about like this is a huge amount of money. My understanding is that's like 1/14 of all their wealth just going to servicing BNR, right? And I think over like the next decade, it's projected like the amount. I think over the next 10 years, they're basically going to have to be spending 15 years. They're going to be spending as much on BNR as like the US GDP in a whole year, right? That is enormous cost, right? So, and then think of how that's affected by COVID, right? And the way their export markets have been hit, right? Because you got to remember, every time China makes a decision, they're not just thinking now, they're calculating it in terms of huge economic growth. Oh yeah, costs are high, but we're growing, so to deal with it, right? So growth dropped from like 8% or something to 3%, right? After COVID, they were the only major country that grew, right? Okay, right. But the point is here that I think already with the international economic situation, they have a lot to shoulder in terms of Belt and Road, and that's why recently at the conference I told you about, where they gave Xi the power to eliminate certain people below him, they they also they adopted a pretty unambitious 5-year plan, and some people were like, "Why is it so unambitious?" Well, I think I know, because they've already see with this Belt and Road thing, especially in all kinds of other, in many other ways, he's really been bold about pushing in new horizons, right? But it's like, I think at a certain point, when there's international recession, when your export markets are hit, right? When you've already assumed these major expenses, it's like at a certain point you just have to stop, and just be like, we have to deal with this, right? Mm-hmm. So that's all I wanted to say about that. But I hope Ernesto, it wasn't too boring, or I just wanted to cover that stuff.
No, I think it's very interesting to understand the BRI in terms of where America is going, right? Mm-hmm. Because and they're saying, yeah, I don't think Chile is. Argentina has a project to build a hydroelectric dam. For example, I don't think Mexico is formally part of the Belt and Road Initiative, but we have joint projects to exploit lithium here in Mexico. So China's playing their cards right. They're betting on growth, and the countries that are signing these deals to watch we should watch that later. Yeah, the Zero Books. This is a revolution.
Yeah, I want to take a look at that. Yeah, that'd be good. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So these countries, of course, we were interested in having the actual development, because what we get is that we get people in our political class whose interests are very deeply aligned with the worst of the bourgeoisie, which is also part of the problem. You're talking either landlords or just outright criminals, right? For example, here in my state, the candidate for governess, I don't know. She's a woman.
Yeah. Governor, I think it's just governor. I mean, I wouldn't say governess, and that's like 19th
Okay,
century.
yeah, governess is a job, right? Whatever.
Kind of old, yeah.
Yeah, it's a thing. Yeah, from Victoria, whatever. So she has ties to human trafficking, and but like Jeffrey Epstein kind of human trafficking.
Oh my God.
Right? Yeah. That's the kind of bourgeoisie we're talking about here. And these are what the political class is putting up front as their best in terms of progressives. It's a joke.
Yeah.
It's a total joke. So I understand when China's saying, yeah, okay, we have this historical actors, right? These people who are part of very deeply part of our historical context of the country, and they feel they have the right to run it or whatever. Of course, the problem they're gonna meet is that that new generations don't want that.
Right? Yeah.
And the challenge here is raising these new generations to be able to replace them, right? To be able to put forth ideas and to challenge them and to be effective actors in politics. But, well, in general, in the third world, what you usually end up facing is that the bourgeoisie will use even the smallest amount of influence they can to advance their own interests. So just get a bunch of corrupt candidates, really.
Yeah, well, and that's what it would be like in China because of the Wild West-like conditions. Like if the nouveau riche were constituting the political class, it would just be like filled with like grifters and people who've profited from illegal activity and so on. Even as it stands, right? Even if you look at the political class as it stands, there's some of those elements. But I think the thing is, like, if you look at China, like the revolution in China and the legacy of that is such a powerful, grip psychologically on people, and rightfully so. So it's like, I think one thing you see in China consistently evinced in terms of polling, and I mean even, polling that's been vetted by Harvard and stuff like that, is you see that there's way more faith in public actors than private actors, right? And again, because I also think the country has a certain foundational leftist values, right? Because of its history that the Western countries don't have to the same degree, would manifest, for instance, in the fact that populism in China is a left-wing manifestation for populism is very telling, right? Because it's sort of like the most like, in a way, it tries to tap into like the deepest subconscious, elements, right, of a social structure, right? You know, so it's like in China, if populism is manifesting itself as neo-Maoism, well, that tells you that that sort of like shapes the public subconscious of China, right? You know, in the West, if it manifests as, you know, fascism or racism, you know, I think that, you know,
Sticks
and I'm not
volumes,
saying
yeah.
Mao was perfect. I'm not saying he was a dove, right? You know, I do think that, you know, the trajectory of his political project was a lot more emancipatory than, you know, the sort of fascist specters that are being summed up in the West, right? Or summoned up in the West. So I think it does tell you something about the overall structure. But the point is just to say, you know, and this is you know, the narrative in China about these things is so different than in the West, right? Like, it's like if you look at social credit, you know, there's been a lot of talk in the West, mostly speculation about what it could become as opposed to what it is really, right? Because like as far as I know, like social credit in China has not been used to police like political views, right? It's like it's about like civic stuff. It's like, you know, it actually it's set up as a trial in all these different jurisdictions, so it really varies. But like it's like if you don't recycle properly or eat on trains or drive your motorcycle on the sidewalk, you know, you get deductions. But mostly actually so far, even that is quite tentative because mostly so far it's just been used to deal with you know, private sector debt and scams in the context of public sector banking, right? So it's mostly, you know, so far, if you look at what it actually is, it's mostly like, you know, if people in the private sector are trying to evade debts they have, you know, they'll freeze them from flying and stuff like that, right? So quite different, I think, than the image of it that's been disseminated in the West. Though there obviously is the potential to abuse the system. But you know, if you look in China, like so in the West, obviously we have credit ratings, right? You know, they can be quite decisive to your ability to live your life and to acquire assets and so forth, right? But those are administered through private sector banks, right? Now, if you look in China, obviously it poses a problem because most of the banking sector is public. So logically, the orchestration of credit ratings is probably going to be a public affair. What people in the West found dystopic about it was the way that certain forms of civic behavior were rolled into that, right? At least on a tentative and experimental basis. And that's an attempt, I think, also to deal with the fact there's been a huge, enormous influx of people from rural areas into big cities, and there's often a lack of kind of civic integration. You know, it's crazy. You've been spitting on the ground and stuff like that, this kind of stuff, right? You know, but it's interesting. Like if you look at Chinese, if you poll them, they're like, no, we want a public credit rating. We don't want a private credit rating. Like 90%. You know, like so again, without commenting too much on the mechanics of this, right? What I'm going to say is that I think, you know, that when you kind of situate the context and understand what it's about, it's quite different than the way it's represented in the West in any case, and it also speaks to the fact that again, people have a lot more faith in public actors in general, right? So you know, when Jack Ma goes and does something, right, like attacks public sector banks, right? You know, now I don't think people necessarily have the strongest emotional attachment to public sector banks. I don't know. But the point is that when leading figures in the private sector attack the public sector, the tendency of the public is to defer to the public sector, right? Now, to what extent is that influenced by propaganda, you know, education? I mean, these are all interesting questions, but that's the reality.
Yeah.
Right. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So do I think the global opinion of China will change after the next year Olympics? Well, that's why they do these things. So hopefully for them, they hope so. I think. I don't know. I'd have to. I don't know like a history of. I don't know how decisive the Olympics are into shifting public perceptions.
Well, Mexico was so bent on having the '68 Olympics that they massacred a bunch of students. So probably very important. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's common, right? The repressions that are implemented around the time of it. I do think that I remember when China had the Olympics. Was it in 2008 in Beijing? Was they had the Olympics before? What year was it? They had them before.
That was 2008. Yeah, 2008.
Yeah, 2008. And that I do think that was a watershed for them. The only thing that I would say now is I think people kind of know China's at the table as like a global market country. So I don't know if the Olympics at this time will be as eligible to shift public opinion, but I think it could have some kind of positive effect. In any case, I think it's something that it's good for them. I think at this time, you know, and I haven't looked into like exactly what they're doing. It could be really sinister, you know. But I mean, in principle, it'll be good for their image at this time. to do that.
Yeah.
But let's look at the text, because I really wanted to get through this stuff because I wanted to talk about the nouveau riche versus the political class in China. I wanted to talk about Belt and Road. I know we went on a long time, but I just think it's important to get those topics off our chest so we can move forward and have a little more knowledge about that and the political structure. Is that? I hope it was informative. I hope it helps.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay, so our first essay. Sorry, guys, for the late start. The first essay we're going to be doing today, and these ones are fairly simple. And the second one, I think, let's go to accelerate the development of housing security and supply first. Okay, it's the first in the book.
It is. Yeah.
It's chronologically actually later, but go to first. Same year. So that's from October 29th, 2013. So he talks here, accelerating housing. Do you want to, how long do we have here? Let's see. Do you want to just read the paragraphs back and forth?
Sure.
Okay, you go to the first one?
Yeah. So it says accelerating housing supply is important for meeting the people's basic need for housing and ensuring that all of them have access to housing. It is a requirement for social fairness and justice, as well as an important measure for the people to share the fruits of reform and development. Party committees and governments at all levels should exercise better leadership to ensure that all the relevant objectives, tasks, policies, and measures are implemented and regard housing, security, and supply as a project of good governance that can stand the test of practice, time, and the people's expectations.
Housing is an issue related not only to the people's livelihood, but also the development of our country. It concerns the people's immediate interests, determines whether they can live and work in contentment, and affects the country's overall economic and social development, as well as social harmony and stability. The party and government have always attached great importance to the housing issue. Thanks to protracted efforts, great achievements have been made in China's housing industry. However, we must realize that we cannot solve our housing problems overnight, as there is still a large number of people having difficulties getting decent housing, a general inadequate supply of basic housing, and an inappropriate and unbalanced allocation of housing resources. Many people lack their own dwelling, so we must be more resolved and make greater efforts to address all the problems standing in the way of housing supply.
In the matter of housing security and supply, we must properly handle the relationship between public services provided by the government and services provided by the market, between the economic and social functions of housing supply, between the needs and possibilities, and between the need to provide housing security and the need to avoid total welfare dependence. We must carry out market-oriented reforms in order to fully enliven the market and meet the multi-level needs for housing. However, there are always people who have housing difficulties due to labor skill mismatch, being out of a job, or low income, so the government must step in to provide them with basic housing.
As conditions stand in China, we in general should build a housing supply system for the government to provide basic housing security and for the market to satisfy multi-level housing demands. We should review and sum up our experience in housing reform and development, learn from other countries in solving their housing problems, study the rules of housing supply, emphasize top-level design, and speed up the establishment of a uniform, standardized, mature, and stable housing supply system. While making every effort to increase the housing supply, we must also do our best to satisfy the people's demand for better housing, establish a sound system of housing standards so that houses are economic, affordable, eco-friendly, energy-conserving, and safe, and advocate a housing consumption mode fitting China's conditions.
According to the 12th five-year plan, the number of basic need housings units built and houses in rundown areas rebuilt will be 36 million, and by 2015, the basic need housing coverage will hit around 20%. This is a commitment made by the government to the people, and we should do whatever we can to fulfill this promise. We should focus on the development of public rental housing, build low-rent housing more quickly, and accelerate the rebuilding of houses in all the rundown areas. In carrying out this project, we must do our best according to our abilities, and endeavor to meet the people's basic need for housing. A residence is home to a family, so its quality and safety are essential. We must improve the planning, accompanying facilities, and design of housing to meet the basic need.
We should improve supporting policies for housing, give full play to the supportive, guiding, and leading roles of such policies, and maximize the enthusiasm and initiative of all sectors. We should improve the land policy, give priority to ensuring that land is used to enhance the people's well-being, introduce a land supply plan in a scientific way, increase residential land supply, and give priority to allocating land for constructing basic need housing. We should improve our fiscal policy and use more public funds to build such housing. We should adopt policies and measures to encourage enterprises and other institutions to build and manage public rental housing. We should also actively explore systems and mechanisms for nonprofit organizations to build and manage basic need housing so that all sides involved can join forces in this endeavor. Building basic need housing is a great endeavor that benefits both the country and the people. But to accomplish this task and ensure that those in need get housing, we must strengthen management and establish procedures for entry, use, and exit of such housing, so as to ensure that people have fair access to public resources. We must make sure that basic need housing is fairly allocated, and that the people who are entitled to it get it. We must stop illegal acquisition of basic need housing and block institutional loopholes in this regard. Those who acquire basic need housing illegally must be punished. Those who acquire basic need housing illegally must be punished according to laws and regulations. Not those who require, those who acquire.
Acquire.
Yeah. So actually, this I thought this essay would be good, not in the sense that it's like that interesting or anything, but in the sense that I think it gives us a good frame to sort of discuss the Chinese housing issue a little bit, which I was curious about, so I dug into. So Chinese homeownership is 90% compared to the United States, which is 65%. That's a huge success, right? That's a huge success. And actually, the reasons for it are really complicated, right? So I want to try to enumerate briefly, if you don't mind. I'd like to just enumerate briefly the reasons for that. So as I see it, and I've had conversations with people, I've been reading about it a little bit, trying to understand it. So the first reason has to do with, so there's a bunch of reasons. It's not like one thing. The first reason has to do with the fact that under the old communist system, there was a lot of people who lived in public housing. And I think when the system passed into a more free market model, those people were either given, like, they had a limit on how much rents could be increased, or they had the opportunity to buy out their own homes inexpensively, right? So I think that in that context, I've heard that, like, I think 1/3 of Chinese people still have homes which are vested from the previous era, right? So that's one major factor. That, like, again, grandfathered rights from the communist era. Two, the second major issue is, in China, we hear about these big housing mega projects. Of course, some of them don't work out. I'm sure everyone's seen the image of the mini Paris China created. It's like they created a miniature version of Paris with an Eiffel Tower as like and it's like empty, like people didn't go move there. Yeah, have you seen that, Ernesto?
Okay, I'm looking it up. Yeah, it's
ridiculous, right? Yeah, I think now under Xi, like the government doesn't want people to make these like pseudo-European enclaves anymore because they consider it like anti-national or something.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like Paris is super well designed in the first place.
Well, be careful there. I mean,
the Corbusier had some great plans for it.
I mean, Paris. I think Paris is very well structured, but I think that if you live here, I think you can see it's very well structured. But I think the reason why it's very, like, people always debate about husbandization, right? Because they went and took like dynamite and just blew up a lot of the old medieval structures to create these big, these big public spaces. So Paris is a modern city in the sense that it's associated with those sort of open spaces, but there was a great cost, in terms of the historical architecture. That having been said, I just hate the old like feudal part of London where there's like the streets are all crammed, everything is just awful. Like,
you just go the Barcelona route and just rebuild the entire city.
Well, I like Barcelona because they did the same thing. Like, they also had modernization initiatives with the feudal architecture, but they built it wasn't as they do have some Place and stuff, but it didn't seem as full bore as Paris. Maybe I'm wrong. Do you mean you say Barcelona was rebuilt? When was it rebuilt?
Yeah, Barcelona. Whole blocks of the city were rebuilt.
Like after the war, you mean, or when?
Yeah. Let me.
Okay. Let me continue with this. Dig into that. Okay. So the first reason I said has to do with vested property from the communist era. The second reason has to do with these major housing, like these huge initiatives, which are also related to stimulus to actually enlarge housing supply, right? The third reason has to do with the fact that in China, the people were telling me this, usually, and this is quite sort of patriarchal, usually men are not able to get married until they own a house, right? So because of that, and also, right, another thing is that usually often parents move in with their kids when they're older. So because of that, Ernesto, you can hear me?
Yes.
Because of that, in China, parents will help their sons, especially, buy homes, right? Because they need to own homes, right, in order to get married, and then they'll move in with their kids to those homes they purchase later on. So there's a big, it's more intergenerational in terms of how the transmission of housing works, right? So there's a lot of support given, I think. The fourth reason has to do with in China, actually, housing isn't cheap, right? It's in relation to incomes, it's rather expensive. But what you have to remember is that wage growth has been so high, right? I think the average in USD, like the purchasing power of the average Chinese person has went up 3 or 4 times, right? The disposable income, let's say, of the average Chinese person has went up 3 or 4 times since 2006. So wage growth has been so high that you have these seemingly expensive mortgages, but the mortgages are priced with the expectation that people will actually be making more money and be able to pay them off, right? So it's a whole mortgage structure that projects into the future, right? So people will get these expensive mortgages and they'll be like, well, I expect just by virtue of living in this country, my income is going to go up, right? And the fifth reason is because the government controls most of the banking sector. So if they want to create policies, right, that favor homeownership, they have more flexibility to do that than a more detached private sector banking structure would, right? That having been said, actually in China, the rate of mortgages is relatively low, right? Interestingly, multiple home ownership is very common. Interestingly as well, a lot of homes are just like bought outright in cash, because the way, again, it's funny, right? The way in Western private banks, usually, like, if you have more assets, they're nicer to you. In China, the rate, like the percent of the mortgage you can take on the home, or like what percent of the value of a home you can take in a mortgage actually goes down with each subsequent property. So in other words, like, you get a worse deal from public banks on subsequent properties, right? If you already own them. So their goal is to get people having a home in the first place.
Not accumulating homes.
Yeah. Though in practice, again, a lot of people have accumulated multiple real estate. But because of this, like, especially with wealthy people, like, and when it comes to multiple home ownerships, a lot of places are pretty much bought like outright in cash because the mortgage rates are extremely low. Like, it's not like a Western structure. So a lot of time people pretty much just go, here's the money. I want to get this place, right? So that's interesting. Another thing about it, by the way, and remember this too, when I say in China, the rate of home ownership is very high, remember as well that in China, the homes are very small, right? I think the average owned property in China, it was something like 25 square meters or something like that. So it's very, very small. So again, like in America, it's 65%, but if you look at the quality and, the size of the homes in America, I think they're going to be quite a bit better, right? So keep that in mind. As you'd expect, right? When you consider how instrumental, these major sort of, these sort of rapidly constructed housing projects have been, right? To facilitating this. But still, it's a big achievement. It's a big achievement to have 90% homeownership. I think that's great. And, it was interesting in the group because we were having this discussion and I said, it's a big achievement. And someone sarcastically, I love these comments people write. They said, oh, wow, socialism. And it's like, I wouldn't even detach that totally from that. It's like, what was the first thing Mao did? Right? Let's go back. Right? What was the first thing Mao did? Right? Mao, he redistributed land. And that was before collective farming. Right? That was when you still had individual farming. Right? So these were really lots controlled by separate farmers. Right? But that was the cornerstone of his initial campaign. Right? Just like let people have their own land. Stop these exploitative feudal structures where people are like, having to have their, surrender surplus product to vested landowners. Right? Stop it. Right? That's the first thing they fucking did. Right? So don't tell me that has nothing to do with socialism or nothing to do with Chinese history. I mean, yeah, it may not be, the higher phase of communism in the Gotha program, right? But rentiers are a parasitic class, right? That's a fact, right? And it's not good in a capitalist economy, and it's sure as hell not good in a socialist economy, whatever we call China, right? State capitalist, whatever, right? And look, like about rentiers, it didn't take socialism to recognize this. I mean, like Ricardo was on like a warpath against the rentier class.
Yeah.
In the UK, there were actually like liberal economists in 19th century England who thought the government should own all property because they're like the problem with rentiers. Now, keep in mind at that time there was a real segregation between the rentier class and the capitalist class. And by the way, this is why we call it real estate. It's the idea that if you're a really privileged person, you have not just estate but real estate. That's real aristocratic. There were liberal economists who went against it. And why did they go against it? Right? I'm sure Xi is supposed to know this, right? Because he recommended Ricardo's on the principles of political economy and taxation in his great books list. So why did they go against it? Because obviously rentierism is bad because it supports a class who basically do not actually are not productive, do not create real value, right? That just sap off the general economy, right? That's bad for people, right? That's clear. But it's also bad for corporations, right? Because we have higher wages, right? Go to Vancouver in Canada. It's over, right? Ironically, kind of not just because, but partly because of the Chinese, because so many Chinese went over there and inflated the housing market, buying homes when they're not actually creating jobs in that region, right? The families of Politburo members or whatever, right? That, now if you start a real business, you have to pay people so much who live in that region. You got general practitioners who are moving out of the city because they can't afford to buy homes, right? So, you have to pay so much that businesses are like, no, I'm going to go to Montreal because in Montreal, you don't pay shit. You can get an old warehouse, right? Like Ubisoft or something like that, right? It's cheaper. So that's what I mean, like that rentierism is not just a tax on the people to support this idle class, right? It's also in our society a tax on companies, right? So I think it's one of those things that everyone should be able to unite against. And I'm really happy. I didn't know this actually until like a couple of weeks ago, but I'm really happy to see that in China they've minimized the power of the rentier class, right? And you want to talk about state capitalism, right? I mean, like that is something that's an obstacle to even capitalist productivity that the West has never liquidated, right? So it's like not only are these guys doing certain aspects of socialism, they also when they do the capital accumulation stuff, that's the irony. Sometimes, not always. Sometimes they do it even better in the West, right?
Yeah.
So
more efficiently.
Yeah. So again, I don't want to glorify that too much, but it points out, it highlights some of the ironies of the situation. But all I meant to say is that it's very complex, right? And ultimately, I think if you look at, I would just stress this. Ultimately, if you look at, the battle against rentierism, right? You can find a great justification for that, in classical works of liberal political economy, within the liberal tradition, people like Ricardo, for example. You can also find a justification for it if you look at the works of Mao, right? So I think in that context, if you consider, sort of the mixed character of China's system, you can see how, it's easy enough to find sort of common ideological ground to pursue those sort of initiatives, right? So that's, of course, as I mentioned before, there is a patriarchal element, of course, with the, it's men, right, who are expected to own homes.
Yeah, men and families. So, also heteronormative.
Yeah. So it's there are, again, China is still, you still have a lot of traditional aspects, to the culture, right? We shouldn't underestimate that, and that just has to do with I think how recent its process of modernization is, right? It's you see now like there's like tentative steps being taken towards combating homophobia and things like this, but it's a different kind of historical cycle. Right. Like what happened in 200 years in the West, in China gets compressed into like 50 years.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, when you look at these kind of stray things, it's like, well, why haven't they dealt with this or that? It's like, there's a lot of stuff to deal with. Right. I'm totally against, homophobia, totally against, those kind of things. But, I think it's also a case of having a lot on your plate and trying to address so many issues simultaneously. But like I said, there was a scandal in China about this issue. We're talking about patriarchy. There's a scandal in China because the in social media, they were censoring displays of affection between gay couples. And I do know, for what it's worth, that the People's Daily, they ran an editorial and they put an image of a gay couple getting married on it. And they criticized social media sites in China within the private sector for taking the stance. And they said, look, like, they said, like, basically the thing it said homosexuality is not it already tells you something about the climate. I think the way they framed it, they said, like, homosexuality is not a mental illness. and what people do in their, it's affection, and what people do in their private lives shouldn't become the basis for discrimination, right? So they haven't moved as far as certain Western countries in liberalizing these things. But look, I'm from Canada, and I remember when gay marriage came in. It's not that long ago. Right? That was like, Canada was before most countries, right? That was 2006. And Canada was forced to, because of a ruling from our Supreme Court, right? 70% of the population were opposed to it, right? Partly because of that, the conservative government came to power because of popular frustrations that were exploited, right, about it. So it's and what I find very interesting about it, just through my life, is seeing the evolution of views on that. In Canada, for better or for worse, we have a really powerful unelected judicial system, which is not good in a sense that it's sort of undemocratic. It can be good in the sense that sometimes it's useful for the advancement of minority rights and so forth, right? Because they set hard judicial precedents for this stuff. But it's been very interesting in my life. I said that decision was juridicially led, not politically led, right? It was, and then politicians sort of politicized it, but in truth, no one had any choice. Like once the what I mean is like the conservatives got a lot of, they attracted a lot of support just for saying we're with the people, we're against it. Right? Yeah. But in the end of the day, they didn't overturn it. You can't. It's a judicial ruling. There's no way to do it. It's the highest.
Yeah, you get the same thing here in Mexico a lot. Conservatives saying they're with the will of the people, and Zizek makes this point, right? That you can't always trust democracy, so to say, because sometimes the conditions are such that the majority of the people hold the wrong opinions.
Yeah, well, it's like the communist poet Fortini says, right? When you make a list of your enemies, write your own name, right?
Yeah.
Alberto Toscano said that in a lecture. I just copied his quote from time. He's translating Fortini, I think. I got Ludovica to look at the actual poem, and she said it's not very good, but that line is very good. So.
That line's good.
Yeah, that's a great line. And it's interesting in my life because that was a juridicially spearheaded decision, right? But it's interesting in my life to see the way that it's affected the transition in popular attitudes, because I remember, like when you talk to a lot of people, about this, and I really see the transition from yeah, I don't want anything to do with those gays, to like, to sort of like, well, I'm okay with it, just not in front of me, not right around me, you got your own private life, to kind of like, well, I'm not a bigot, and what people do, they do, it's like, this sort of evolution, right? Pardon my sort of working class caricature, right? But it is true, right? That, there's a certain populist consensus about these issues, and it has evolved over time. And and I just find it very interesting to see the way it's evolved, right? And in a pretty short period of time, right? I would say that evolution is mostly, like even through the 3 stages I was describing, in many respects that's happened just in 2 decades, right? So I was just saying that these are recent things. They're really recent things, even in the West. Right. And I think what's important in China, like if you look at Russia, homophobia rates are really high. And why is that? Because the government's actually exploited it. What did Russia unveiled, like a straight flag or something that's now been memed pervasively throughout the internet? I don't know. It's the pink and blue flag. Russia came up with a straight flag. The point is, like, social conservatism, the revival of the Orthodox Church, nationalism, social conservatism, all of these things have been exploited by the state, right? In order to, position themselves, in contraposition to the West, and to augment their authority. So if you look in Eastern Europe, you have a lot of the lowest rates in the world of approval for gay marriage, right? That's not even a natural phenomenon, right? That is at that level because of the way political actors have been. I mean, what is a natural phenomenon? I guess you could ask. But even in these rates are so low, partly because of the way these issues have been exploited by political actors, right? And I think one thing that's very important in China is that the government has not been exploiting those issues, right? So, and by the way, we should talk. I want to address another little issue pertaining to China as well. Sorry, this conversation is very free range today, but I think it's good that we get some stuff off the table because there wasn't too much to read. And I don't know if I even want to get along with the second essay because I don't know if it's really one that but about another issue, I noticed, so we should talk about the stuff going on in Israel and Palestine a little bit. And I think bringing China into that conversation can be sort of helpful. So I've seen a lot. No, I was at a panel the other day for Red May in Seattle. They do some wonderful online events, with Michael Onreich and Toscano on the Cultural Revolution and so on. Very interesting stuff. And I saw a panel, and Andreas Malm was there, and he was very emotional at the panel because he'd just been at a Palestinian march. He's a Swedish kind of anarcho-Marxist, eco-socialist, and has helped draw a lot of attention. He's very passionate, very strong, strongly worded opinions, and he expressed his how appalled he was by what was going on in Palestine. And then he started to go and kind of praise, he was, oh yeah, he said, and even people like Mohammed Daif, who's the military leader of Hamas, he said his family has been killed by, Israel, as someone that we should admire in certain ways. And this is sort of proto-genocidal actions, chanting death to Arabs and so on. And Anselm Jappe, another critical theorist of German origin, but he studied in France and Italy. He actually got really angry, and he dropped out of the panel. He started. He said, "I'm not going to tolerate this stuff. Is saying Israel genocide and valorizing Hamas." It shows you how intense these issues are, right? It's like a pistol fire at a concert.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I looked through some of Malm's writings in Salvage, and I know he has valorized some of Hamas to some extent. I don't really feel like, we talk a lot about China here. I don't feel so comfortable commenting on the issue. Do you have anything you want to say about that, Ernesto? I know a little bit about Israel and Palestine, the 6 Days War and this stuff, but I'm just a bit. In a second, I want to just discuss it maybe a little bit in relation to China. But do you have anything you want to say about that issue and what you've been seeing going on?
Yeah, it's this is quite a controversial issue. Yeah, sure. I mean, I personally don't agree. Our country hasn't asserted Israel's right to defend itself. I recently read a great article by Ben on Jacobin, right? Exploring a little bit about Israel's right to exist, and he asserted this position that people have a right to exist, right? And the point is that the way the situation is right now, there is no future for sort of peaceful resolution where you have two states, right? There is no you can't assert a kind of an Israel without transgressing on so many Palestinian rights, so to speak, and the people of Palestine also have a right to their land and to their own well-being, which I think the point is here, kind of following with the critic of China. This is not about Israel and Palestine, but about ulterior motives of capitalism.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I
think
right
the United
now,
States. Sorry to interrupt. Just to
please go on. Please go on as long as.
Yeah. Okay. Just to wrap up that point, I think that the United States confirmed $32 billion of military aid, not general aid, military aid for Israel. So, yeah, I mean, I think the interests are very clear.
Yeah. I mean, what I noticed, and actually I should have read this before because there's a great Wikipedia page on Chinese-Israeli relations. It's quite wonderful and detailed. But what I noticed, was I looked over some of the leftist groups in the past few days, and what I saw was that there were people who were like attacking China because they were like, oh, China is like in bed with Israel, right? And this I got to say, it's like, okay, China is one of the few countries in the world that maintains simultaneous relations with Israel and Palestine. I think that it operates like one of the ports in Israel. It's purchased weapons from Israel. Israel, I think, was the first country to recognize the PRC government. Am I not mistaken? The first country in the Middle East to recognize the PRC government, and that has to do with the particular, because I think the Soviet Union was the first country to recognize Israel. So in the early, Israel after the 6 Days War, in particular, and even earlier, really, Israel swung to the side of the West. But early on, there was a strong affinity with the communist bloc.
Very early on.
Yeah. I think I think it shifted gradually, though the 6 Days War, I think, was the real cut, right? In terms of because that was after '67, the Soviet Union really swung its support behind the Arab world, and that kind of paves the way for some of the, tensions between America and the Middle East in the '70s as well. But if you look at, at China, on the other hand, what you have to say is that China has been very consistent about supporting a Palestinian state, right? And right now, when it comes to this current issue, right, the United States and China have found themselves. By the way, Palestine's part of Belt and Road, I believe, which I think is funny. But good. But so this is they're recognized in that capacity, and also, China's been very consistent about that position, and we need two states, right? And the United States and China are now finding themselves on different ends of the Security Council over this issue, right? I guess what I find, and China, was very clear. They said, look, the reason these tensions are occurring is because there wasn't a just solution to the Palestinian issue that was reached, right? That's why this is happening. It's not just terrorists. It's not just vagabonds, right? There's a fundamental problem here that's not being addressed. One can critique China's position. You can say maybe it's hypocritical to play both sides of the fence, whatever you want, right? But the point is here again that the United States has unequivocally aligned itself with Israel, unequivocally.
Yeah.
Right? So the fact that in left-wing groups people are, think like it's worthwhile to single out China for scrutiny because it supports Palestine but has simultaneous trade relations with Israel. Okay, maybe that's not BDS standard. Like, me, I'm not going on vacation in Israel because it's like, I have no, I would love to go there. I'd love to see Jerusalem and everything, but it's not even me, it's just like, it's just people I care about from the Middle East who have shared that they don't think it's a good idea. And when enough people, you respect who are on the left, when they say that, it's like, you got to listen, right? I'm not an expert in these issues, right? But I know who I respect. But all I want to say about this is if you look at, there you go, Ender Wiggin, right? The other two members of the Security Council, Britain and France, who are responsible for this whole mess, don't even say peep. China wants to gather the Security Council. The US says no, right? And this is all very telling. So what I want to say about it is that, China's position may not be perfect, right? And China is very flawed as a country, as we hope we've enumerated, many times throughout this whole series here. But the idea that, we should be focusing on China and their complicity with Israel when you have many countries in the West that have unequivocally given their support to the state of Israel. I mean, let's be clear here, right? China may be a big trading partner with Israel, right? But the country that really has the power, right, to sway things, the United States, right? And if the United States decided tomorrow that Israel's cut off if they don't find a solution will be produced within a month, right? Because they couldn't survive without that support, right? So again, I find it very, very disturbing in this climate that people would be trying to, twist this conflict into a pretext to criticize China, while simultaneous with this entire campaign and campaign of propaganda that's being drummed up against them. Right, it shows you, I think, how manipulable a lot of people are on the left in terms of how they're acting, right? We've never said like, I think it's funny, like people calling us like China Sims and stuff. It's like I don't think there's any way to like research a topic if you just approach it like, oh, it's just genocide all the way down, You know, like how can that even engender interesting research, interesting discussion, right? We've tried to approach this like, you know, you can see lots of parallels in the way that it's approached by Michael Roberts, David Harvey, Samir Amin. I think, you know, sympathetically to some extent, but quite critically as well, you know. But as we can see right now, you know, any kind of, you know, even I think informed attempts to delve into these issues, even intellectually curious attempts to delve into these issues, are often simply, you know, designated as, you know, oh, you're a pawn, right? You know, the malevolent Chinese, you know. So, you know, that's unfortunate. But I just meant to say, I think it's really, you know, it's sad to me that we have this division in Israel and Palestine, which as many people have rightfully pointed out, you know, is grotesquely unjust in terms of the treatment of the Palestinian people. I think it's sad as well that there are people out here who want to use this issue, you know, as a further sort of cudgel to beat China with at a time where they're being attacked by the West, right? In large part because of their rapid economic ascent, right? You know, I think that's completely wrong, you know. So again, I'm not saying that it's great, you know, go do business with Israel, whatever. But who should we be talking about here, really? Jesus Christ, right? Where does Israel derive its legitimacy from, right? Because it seems to me that if anything, you know, the fact of China recognizing Palestine, the fact of China speaking for Palestine, because it is the second most powerful country in the world, right? Which means that China is the most powerful country in the world that supports Palestine. That's what it means. Right. So in what's increasingly becoming a bipolar world, it seems to me that even if China has simultaneous relations with Israel, which by the way, I'm sure Palestine isn't thrilled with, you know, the point is though that Palestine Palestine's not saying, you know, we're going to rebuff your support if you don't cut off Israel, because they know how absolutely essential it is, right, to have the support of one of the world's two major powers, right, behind them, you know, without which they would be, I think their position, you know, they'd have considerably less legitimacy, right? So I'm saying in the overall balance of forces, I just think it's absurd to fixate on that, you know, and to say that's the problem, you know, like, come on, man, like, you know, but it does show you, again, it shows you the double standard, right, in terms of how people approach this issue. Any thoughts on that, Ernesto?
Well, I think it's very well related to the next essay, right?
Oh, you want to do that? You want to? Okay, you want to dig it?
We can just go through it so we don't.
Let's do it through it quickly. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, this one I know because we've talked a lot about Taiwan. This one deals with Taiwan. I just thought some of the historical stuff in it was sort of interesting. And maybe you can take the lead on this one if you want. That'd be good.
Sure. Yeah. So the essay is called "Handled Cross-Strait Relations in the Overall Interests of the Chinese Nation."
So this was the talk with Wu Pushao, honorary chairman of the Kuomintang of China and his delegation. Sorry, you can go ahead.
Yeah. I'll just go ahead and read it then. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Over the past 5 years, thanks to the concerted efforts of the two parties, two sides, and people from both sides of the Taiwan Straits, we have opened a right path and made important progress in the peaceful development of Cross-Straits Relations. Oh yeah. Turkey right now. Yeah, sure, with Cyprus. Yeah, of course. Under the new circumstances, the CPC Central Committee will continue to follow its established policies and commit itself to consolidating and pushing forward the trend of peaceful development of cross-straits relations and bringing benefits to the people and the Chinese nation as a whole. I hope both parties and both sides will continue to enhance mutual trust, maintain constructive interaction, and steadily promote the comprehensive development of cross-straits relations, strengthen the foundation for peaceful development, unite with all the people on two sides of the straits, and work collaboratively towards the great renewal of the Chinese nation. So,
do you want to keep going? Can you do that?
I just want to mention that, she just pretty much brings up the same thing over and over again, right? These paragraphs are a lot of reiterating, right, about handling cross-strait relations in the overall interest, he says, for example, of the Chinese nation, right? He says that although the mainland and Taiwan are yet to be reunited, they belong to one and the same China, which is an indivisible whole. I don't know what you think about that, but I feel that, you know, this is kind of the same. Reminds me of the appeal that he was giving about housing about creating a harmonious society, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, were you going to read a bit more? Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So yes, I'll read. Right. Okay. He says peaceful development of the cross-straits relations has become a part and parcel of China's great renewal. A prevailing trend of development is breaking away from outdated perceptions. And he says that they should pool the wisdom and strength of the Chinese people on both sides of the straits, right? Working to heal the historical trauma, strengthen mutual trust. Um, Increasing mutual trust lies in reaching a clearer common understanding of an identical stance. And here I think is one of the key points. He says seeking common ground while reserving differences. I'm pretty sure she has used that phrase before in other essays. But yeah, it feels like that's kind of the primary point. He hopes two sides will work together to make even greater achievements in cross-strait relations. Again, just reiterating the same thing over and over again, expanding the scope of peaceful development of the relations. And finally, he says, fourth, promote the comprehensive development of the relations. Hard to keep the relations stable. And here's a kind of a warning. He says, forces and activities for Taiwan independence remain a real threat to the peace of the Taiwan Straits. It is therefore incumbent upon us to oppose and contain any rhetoric or move for Taiwan independence without any compromise. He says that this is with the purpose of expanding the scope and texture of cooperation and thereby generating even greater benefits. Again, of course, there is a lot to critique in the sense that this can all just be cynical and not being about the facts. But putting that aside, I want to go back to the essays that we were reading last week, the one about innovation, right?
Yeah.
And I think again, to the allusion that you made about being rich is glorious. Again, what kind of richness are we talking about here, and what kind of prosperity awaits Taiwan if they stay independent? Again, I don't want to decry the people's right to self-determination and so on, but we saw what happened with Brexit, right? Here in Mexico, we also have a bit of a joke, of course, but there are of course high bourgeoisie who are very interested in this kind of a balkanization of Mexico. Again, it's not very realistic, but they have a whole civil society thing that they run, right? And that they identify with and they organize around. And what this does is that it just creates in unnecessary political conflict that doesn't benefit the people of their territories. It only benefits them. It only benefits their image, their position in politics, but it doesn't actually give the people that they preside over any actual benefit. In fact, usually these, again, as I was saying, it happened in Great Britain. This brings general, negative effects. I don't know another word to use.
Yeah. I think with this whole issue, you have to kind of you have to consider like so I'm not like an expert in the whole issue, but for a long time there was very little contact between the three regions. In fact, and we can see here if we look at the three links, right? If we're talking about where the three links, how do we see that? It was postal, air, postal, transportation, trade. Okay. And the three links were only realized, I think, in the era of Deng, right? The three links were only brought out. So before that, in other words, right? Like I read, for instance, there were no flights between Taiwan and China from 1950 to 2008.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, it's like these are pretty serious, kind of things. So for a long time, right? Like pretty much, from Mao into the Deng era, without getting into, I don't know all the exact detail, but there wasn't much interaction. Of course, Taiwan was being supported by the West in various ways, right? Since then, relations have changed, right? If you look, actually there was a turning point. I think it was was it 1978 or 82? 1 second. It was 1 second. What happened? I'm trying to remember exactly what it was. But what happened was that there was a basically there was an airplane. 86 actually. There was a China Airlines cargo airplane, and the Taiwanese pilot was subdued, and the plane was flown to Guangzhou so some guy could defect to China, right? And after that, like traditionally, like between China and Taiwan, they had something called the three no's policy, right? Which was the which just goes to show that the numbering isn't exclusive to communist China. The numbered list, right? They have these. I guess it's just a Chinese thing in general. But that was no contact, no negotiation, no compromise, right? Those are the three no's. After that, there was delegates sent to Hong Kong to discuss which is like a neutral zone, right? To discuss returning the airplane, and this actually was a watershed in terms of opening up in relations, right? What happened after that, you had sort of fluctuations in relations, but basically I think like a lot of the subsequent, the breakthroughs in relations were driven by Taiwanese investment in Hong Kong after the adoption of their cheap labor strategy, right? So there had already been, even prior, like even while the country was still officially maintaining the three no's policy, right? If you go back to the opening up that had started even years before 86, there had already been Taiwanese companies that were welcomed as investors, right? I think what you see in general, and this is what I want to stress, is that Deng Xiaoping alters the strategy, right? So Deng Xiaoping is like, like we can pit ourselves against these people forever, but that doesn't seem to be making headway. So why don't we try to, because China is much bigger, why don't we try to enrich our country, right? And economically intertwine the two countries. And Deng never gave up on the idea of integrating Taiwan with China, one China, though he did say if they integrate, they can keep their own political system and blah, blah, right? But he said like it is one country. But that was basically his approach, right? He was like, we should try to cultivate links with Taiwan and to make Taiwan dependent on enlarged and enriched China, right? This led to different oscillations. After Deng, you had various oscillations in terms of the positions of different leaders. I'm looking at it here. So you have, sorry, 1 second here. Yeah, you have. There was at some point. Politically, there were moments, right, throughout this entire process where they would say things like relations between two countries. So China actually hasn't been entirely clear, right, regarding how they approach this. It depends on the leadership, and it's kind of fluid, right? But like, and by the way, funny thing, because we know Jack Ma, right? That troublemaker, Jack Ma. Apparently, he said that China should follow. Was it? 1 second. This is. Here, wait. Wait 1 second. Yeah, I don't know. I can't find it here, but I read something before. Anyway, I thought Jack Ma said something like China should follow like the path of peace and freedom that's been opened up in the Republic of China or something like that. Which maybe you don't want to say. Not the most politically savvy thing to say. Anyway, so there were some oscillations in these positions over the years. Generally, Xi Jinping has been pretty adamant about it being one country. But again, like because of the density of the trade relations, and because now you have like the three links having been established and all of this, there is a high level of interdependency. So it's a complex thing. But I want to highlight. We already know, I don't need to delve too much into the ancient past because we already know, not the ancient past, but, pre-Deng past, because we already discussed and know some of the history about, the Kuomintang and how they went there, after the conclusion of the Civil War and this sort of thing. Chiang Kai-shek, blah 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 blah, right? And subordinated really violently subordinated the indigenous population, right? And then I don't think Taiwan became properly, like, it was basically led by a Kuomintang military dictatorship until the 80s or something like that, right? So when people talk about Taiwan as this bastion of democracy, it's important to remember as well that that's a fairly recent development, right? As with many such extensions of democracy, only arriving near the end of the Cold War, let's say. Let me check the exact year on that when Taiwan became a democracy. 1 second. Actually, there's a great film by there's a great film. So Taiwan became a democracy in what year? Supplementary elections for the National Assembly in 1980. Yeah, I don't know. I think maybe it was 80. I don't know. Oh no. Okay. No. Yeah. No, it was ended in 1987. Actually, that's what I was thinking near the end of the Cold War. It was my original thought. 38-year-long consecutive martial law period between 20 May 1949 and 14 July 1987. That is a long martial law period. I gotta say, that is a long 38 years. That is long. President Chiang Quing-ko withdrew it, and I think there were probably enforcement was slowly relaxed after Chiang Kai's death in 1975. However, it extended firmly till the exposure of Donggang incident by international media reportage and the follow-up parliament questioning by newly elected Democratic Progressive Party members in 1987. So the Donggang incident, I assume this was police shooting protesters or something. 19 unarmed Vietnamese boat people were killed by the Republic of China's military. That's not good. A boat carrying Vietnamese refugees had been rejected in Hong Kong earlier, requesting political asylum. General Zhao refused the request. Wow. Yeah. So basically, this was a big controversy because the Taiwanese military, there was a boat of Vietnamese seeking refuge, and the Taiwanese military was ordered to execute them all and to try to hide their bodies by burying them on the beach, like 20 people. So that's like pretty grotesque. So I guess what it's saying is I guess the implication in the article is that the international backlash from that triggered a process. They'd already been easing off, right, from a more dictatorial model since Chiang Kai-shek's death in 1976. But that the international backlash triggered them to try to sort of improve their reputation abroad by explicitly democratizing to a greater degree, right? So that only happened. I just mean to say that only happened. Relatively late. But the point is here, I want to say that this is an interesting thing to discuss, right? What happens with Taiwan. I think there's a link with Hong Kong, obviously, right? And I think what's interesting about it is that both in the Taiwan and the Hong Kong case, I think there was this idea that, like, well, if we grow economically, if we become interdependent with these places, that we'll be able to integrate them into China. I think in some ways, like, relations between China and Taiwan haven't been that great over the past few years, right? I think in 2000 you had the victory of the Democratic Progressive Party, which is a Taiwanese nationalist party. Yeah, so the Democratic Progressive Party was a traditional opposition party to the Kuomintang, right? Again, if you look at, I need to break it down in terms of all the parties, but there are basically three political factions in Taiwan. So in Taiwan, you have people like Kuomintang loyalists, right, who are like, we are from the Kuomintang, we have the right to govern. You have pro-independentists who are from the indigenous population, right, who are opposed to Kuomintang hegemony, but still want Taiwan to be independent of China. And then you have Chinese, many of whom have migrated there in recent decades. That's another thing that really connects the places. A lot of Chinese people went there because it was wealthier. You have migrants, a lot of whom are from the mainland, who support the integration of Taiwan into China. So those are basically like the three factions. It looks to me here like maybe the DPP is. It looks to me here like maybe they represent the indigenous Taiwanese population. Yeah, I mean they're connected to the Tang Y or outside the KMT movement. But I mean, I don't know. It may also just be. I think it may at some point this may just converge with general pro-democratic sentiment, right? So I don't know. I'd have to do more research into it, right? But the point is, it's very complex. These are really complex topics, right?
Yeah.
But the point is here that so there are three basic political factions in Hong Kong. What I was saying is that if you look at Taiwan and you look at Hong Kong, in a sense, I feel like there's an overlap because if you look at these policies of economic integration, yeah, they have, an economic integration you have on both sides. Right? When the Chinese cheap labor policy was brought in, who were the big investors early on? Taiwan, Hong Kong, right? Those are the big investors early on. So before even like the states got in there, right? Because that was still a bit like chancy for them. The states, long-term enemy. I mean, Taiwan and Hong Kong are in the region. They were in the zone, and they had just very deep ties, linguistically, culturally, and so on, right? I mean, I know that. There's some differences in the language. But though I understand that the language they speak in Taiwan is like, it's basically the same as, it's just modern Chinese as implemented by the PRC, but the orthographic system is different. So in the old days, they used to write, the Kuomintang leaders used to write in Japanese because the orthographic system wasn't developed in Chinese. We were talking about this last time, I think. But I just want to say that if you look at this whole situation, economic integration hasn't necessarily succeeded in bringing about political integration, right? I mean, in Hong Kong, obviously, it's succeeded to some extent. Hong Kong is officially part of China, but look at the last few years, right? There's been huge protests, right? Huge unrest. Taiwan hasn't even been politically integrated, right? Both have been economically integrated, just by I think sheer force of the changes in that region. And I think, I think in a way, this is, if we talk about C being like kind of hardline, I think this is also part of what it's connected to is the feeling that economic pressure and economic integration may not be enough to bring about, what is sought by China, which is the hegemonic control over the Chinese territory, right? In other words, like the reunification of China proper, right? And these fissures have been obviously fueled enormously by colonialism and neocolonialism. Right, Hong Kong is a British territory, right? Taiwan would not have been able to exist independently, without the support of the West. I mean, it could have been very easily taken by China a long time ago, right? And it's easier to do these things to strike out at the beginning because, like, once a place kind of, acquires its own, once its national independence is legitimized, it's a lot harder to do that. I'd have to dig into it, but like I'm certain that were it not for pressure from the international community, that China would have pushed in a long time ago, right? Though it is a little awkward militarily potentially because they brought over all the nationalist forces and it's an island, right? So I don't want to say that it's too easy, but I'm sure they could have done it at some point, if not for Western. So I just mean I think part of the reason again that C has taken this hard line is because it's like people are like, how are we going to solve these problems? Because now there's a problem in Hong Kong and there's a problem in Taiwan. Right. And it's very hard. It's like, if you look at like, China keeps saying one country. Well, a third of Taiwanese support, right? They don't have anything like a majority. Right. Yeah. And in that context, it's very hard to operate because it's understandable. Like you don't want, in Taiwan, traditionally they pointed, maybe even today, I have to double check, but they've had like missile systems, US missile systems pointed at China, all kinds of stuff, right? It is a liability in terms of national security to have something like that. As surely as, albeit, in a different ideological context, Cuba being supported by the Soviet Union was a liability for the United States, right? That's a liability, and I think it's natural that as China becomes more dominant in the Asian region, that they're going to, there are the regional security will be enhanced. But how do you deal with it? It's a very hard question, right? I don't think in Hong Kong they particularly like, I don't think a lot of people don't identify with China. In Taiwan, a lot of people don't identify with China. And there's no, as much as people can say like, oh, well, that's just because they're not liberal enough. They need to be more democratic. There's no magical switch you can hit, right? China's decisions, however much they may at any given point reflect the character of the leadership or whatever. In a lot of respects, they're also affected by the economic and structural context in which they operate, right? Obviously, Taiwan and Hong Kong are small regions that were given enormous support by the West. Hong Kong, a very wealthy port, and was really a white supremacist state until the 70s. And the British, as they knew they have to hand it over, they kind of democratized it. And that you see how successful those propaganda campaigns were.
Yeah.
Right. Because people in Hong Kong, they're totally like, you see people out there like waving American and British flags, like crazy stuff. Trump save us, this kind of thing. I like Zizek on that. He said it's first. I said, of course I support Hong Kong independence. But then I see these people with these saying, with American flags saying Trump save us. Okay, come on, get real. It's like this. Yeah. And that's the thing, right? It's like, it's just complicated because it's like, and this is why I always say it's complicated. Like, I'm not out there being like one way, and I know for some people they just support the protesters, and it's a very complex thing, right? I mean, there's a lot of, it's like there are a lot of reactionary elements that embed themselves in those movements, and I don't think it's everybody. Sure as hell, there's lots of people, real leftists, Marxists in the Hong Kong independence movement, no doubt, right? And those people, that's different. I support those people. But look, in terms of the composition of these movements, it's a bit tricky, right? It's like people saying, like the Falun Gong or a persecuted religious group, you should support them. It's like, then you look at what they do at the Epoch Times, promoting outrageous racism, anti-vaxxer theories, right? Pro-Trump messaging and all of this, right? And that's what I mean. Like, I think sometimes in the West, we have this habit of kind of jumping on, any movement that has sort of like a pro-democracy aesthetic, any ostensibly or even really persecuted religious group or spiritualist movement or whatever, we're like, defend the rights. Some of these things are kind of bad, so I think we need a more nuanced commentary or have bad elements. And so I think we need a more nuanced commentary than just, defend, right? What I've said about Hong Kong in terms of my position, Hong Kong, what people were really shocked when it went over to the PRC at first, how light it was, like how much they were permitted to keep doing their thing. I mean, the fact of the matter is that Hong Kong, is wealthy largely because of, rents that are extracted at this point from the backs of Chinese workers, right? That's the reality. They were permitted to maintain their system. I support that. I support the maintenance of Hong Kong's separate system, till 2046. I support it, right? Do I support Hong Kong independence? There's no historical precedent for that outside the context of British colonialism, right? So to the extent that, so a lot of the reality is a lot of these protests were triggered by, issues that were, I think in the grand scheme of things, a little bit tangential in terms of, the particular thing was the law for deportation, right? China was wanting to, there was a law passed by the Carrie Lam, like the local government, to permit people being deported to the PRC, right? And by the way, in the agreement, I think it's 86, in the agreement that was signed by China and Hong Kong, China has the right to put troops there if there's a security issue. Not saying they should, but they have that right. Because some people were saying, oh, it's like a violation of, they didn't, by the way, they haven't put troops there. Yeah, I'm saying that, but they have the right to respond forcefully anyway. The United States brought in the National Guard for the other year. But what I'm saying here is that to the extent that what's being fought for, if this were really fundamentally a question of like, the freedoms that are being afforded to Hong Kong, then I think people absolutely should be out there and defending it. I think some of these issues are a little bit more tangential, and I think that they become a proxy for the larger fact of people just not wanting to be a part of the PRC, right? And I think that, like the deportation law, it's like, okay, maybe that's not great, but is that really what this is about? Right? And I don't think it necessarily is what it's about. Right? I think what it's about is that there are very different national and cultural conceptions, right, which have been diffused in these regions. And this is part of the cost of China's tolerationist policy, right? Is that it's like, like you keep your system. Well, that system is diffusing totally different messages and values, right? No, I'm not saying they're worse in every respect, right? That's not what I'm saying, right? But they're different values. So here we go. I guess what I question is, I think in many ways the animus for the protest is not so much that the lives of people in Hong Kong have been so dramatically affected by this. I think it's that there's just discomfort with the fact of being part of China. And of course, there are certain tangible effects, but I think a lot of it is just discomfort with this structure, right? And the difference between their respective systems. And I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say about that. China was never. It was never independent. It was British, then it was Chinese, right? And it was British because of colonialism. The century of shame, century of humiliation. Systemic. Getting the Chinese population intentionally addicted to opium. Shipping it everywhere and selling it. This is a horrific legacy. So I don't know what to tell people. I just don't think it's realistic, and I don't know the risk with all this. As much as some of it may have been well-intentioned, the risk, of course, is that the real risk is that China just decides, like, we're not, the toleration policy isn't working, so we got to be tougher. That's a real possibility that could come out of this, right? And then will it have been worth it, right? To get upset that some of the finer points of what someone felt to be the agreement weren't being respected, right? Because I said in the main it has been respected, right? Hong Kong is very autonomous in terms of its structure. And it's not like China's ever had to do that. I mean, Britain's not going to invade them, right? The West can't really do anything, right? So that's been upheld sort of voluntarily, So I don't think that their actions in Hong Kong have been so deplorable. But I do think there's a systemic difference in the values of the regions. And I think that results in an inflation of the severity of any given issue, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. We're getting instructions from our production team over in the chat.
Oh, are you? What did they say?
Yeah.
Let's wrap it up, guys. Got to get lunch. Okay, yeah, it's been 2.5 hours. Let me just say though about Taiwan. I think Taiwan is maybe a more sensitive issue. A few years ago when I looked at the issue, I thought of it in terms of the continuity of the Civil War. Well, the Chinese won the Civil War. They're the rightful leaders. They should have Taiwan. Right. I do support one country in general, but I do think that however brutal the occupation may have been by the Kuomintang, I think that the desires of the indigenous population has to be factored in any resolution of that issue. So I sincerely hope that China and Taiwan are able to become more integrated. But I think when you look at the whole situation, again, very complex. More complex, I think, even than the Hong Kong thing. So in the Hong Kong thing, you have Cantonese and Chinese, right? In the Taiwan thing, you have nationalist, communist, in the indigenous side.
Yeah.
So you have kind of three.
I think at least the upside that we can get from this is that things like the entwining of the economy are positive for the people, right? I mean, of course, it heightens the contradictions and so on. I understand all of that. But in the end, you're creating conditions where people can be more educated, better well prepared to face these circumstances on their own without the help of foreign aid.
Yeah, and also just understand as well that just because people are becoming rich, just because they have strong economic relations with the place, that there's a really once certain democratic liberal freedoms have been diffused. However, the process through which they arrive, I could say in Britain, I could say it was sort of cynical for the British to shoehorn in democracy at the last minute in Hong Kong. But however they arrive at that, naturally enough, people develop a very strong emotional relationship to these values, and it's including the working classes often. So it's very hard and I'm not talking about taking them away, because I don't think China is talking about taking them away. But the point is that people, it really defines their identity. And I think it can be a very strong resistance to anything defined as encroachment upon that, right? Also, I don't think it's just democratic values. I think that, we see that, for material as well as cultural and social reasons, I think throughout much of the third world, the West is still perceived as being, the real thing, right? China is just a pretender, right? They don't have the authority, they don't have the culture, they don't have, the modernist culture, they don't have the, the same wealth, they don't have the same resources. So innovation, and I think in the third world you find plenty of that sentiment. I want to end just by saying that I mentioned before that there was a dispute in China between Xi Jinping and the premier Li Keqiang, and I want to give a little anecdote, because I was talking about the sense of being inferior to the West, like people in Hong Kong being like, we want to be part of Britain again, the sense of being perceived as less capable stewards or as an inferior system altogether. Li Keqiang, this is something people do feel, as I'm sure you're aware. Li Keqiang at one point he held up a pen, right? He said we make 800 million tons of stainless steel every year in China. And he said, but the steel tips of the pens we make, right? He said, to make high quality pens, we still have to import them from other countries because we're not capable of using our steel to make pens that are as good as like German or Swiss pens, right? We have 800 million tons of stainless steel. We have all the materials, right? But we can't make a pen, right? That's as good as pens in Europe, right? And obviously, pens aren't that important part of the economy, but it was symbolic, right? What he was saying. It's just what Xi's saying. He's saying we have to shift. We have to be better, right? We have to become more innovative. We have to, and I think that the bottom line is that, political system or no, systemic political changes or no, in terms of Taiwan and Hong Kong, which have such deep attachments to the West, China will always be perceived as a sort of pretender, as long as, the West as a region is construed to be absolutely authoritative in the world, right? Economically, socially, etc. Right? Is that good? Yeah.
That's a great way to wrap it up.
Okay, so guys, this has been 2.5 hours. Kind of random today. We went on different topics and discussed things, but I hope it's been informative. I really wanted to just get in a lot of things we maybe hadn't addressed in as much depth. So I hope it was good for everyone. I hope we certainly I learn a lot doing this, because a lot of the time I'm kind of learning on the fly. Just pulling up Wikipedia pages and reading them while we're doing this. But it's for me anyway. It's been, I don't know, Ernesto, you feel, for me it's been hugely informative.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, this whole, and I hope everyone comes out of this being like, everyone who's watched all the lectures or has been here, like you and Timothy. I hope everyone, myself certainly, all feel this way, but I hope everyone comes out of this just being like, feeling like they know something anyway. So the basics of modern China. Okay, guys. Well, we're gonna log out now. Thank you so much, and we will see you next week on May 23rd. Okay.
Bye, everyone.